Everyone thought I was Declan's most obedient dog, but no one knew I'd long been hiding a burning ambition to destroy the entire clan. I even ran off with their grimoire and was reborn back to my childhood, all because one day I saw a wyvern, freer than any creature alive, gliding and soaring through the clouds without a care in the world, and that was the only reason that I, the top crisis management specialist of the renowned Declan magical family, decided to walk away. From that moment on, I took the grimoire and made my move. To break free from the clan's grip, I chose to leave and never look back. The whole way I did everything I could to cover my tracks. But even so, the clan's men never stopped hunting me down. I had no choice but to take out every assassin that came after me, one by one. It was only later that I realized they were after me purely for the grimoire, not because they'd caught wind of my revenge plan, and certainly not because they valued my overwhelming strength, the kind that could silence anyone. Turns out I was nothing but the clan's cleanup dog all along, just a pawn they could throw away whenever they pleased. That greedy Declan clan, always coldly calculating every gain and loss, which, in a way, proved I was right to take the grimoire. Not only was it worth a fortune, it could help me achieve both freedom and revenge in one fell swoop. Seeing me go quiet, the man sent to chase me tried to coax me, saying there was still time to hand over the grimoire, and he'd plead with the clan head on my behalf for leniency. I let out a scornful laugh and asked what kind of dog he thought he was, to actually think he could sway the clan head. Even more laughable, here he was on the brink of death, shamelessly asking if I had any last words. Just then, I suddenly sensed something was off. A powerful, indescribable force was closing in fast, so that was what gave him the nerve to bark like that. The next second, a bone-chilling wave of danger locked onto me. A deep voice echoed out from the shadows, and then the figure slowly stepped into the light. He introduced himself, said he was the head of Declan. I was momentarily stunned. I had given half my life to the Declan clan, and this was the very first time I'd laid eyes on its master, Declan, the foremost magical family on the eastern continent. The clan head said to be the most powerful mage in recorded history. I'd always been curious about what kind of man he was, but now that we'd met face to face, he just left a sour taste in my mouth. I'd nearly gotten myself killed to get my hands on this grimoire, and here he was expecting to take it with his bare hands, shameless and despicable to the core. The Declan clan head first chuckled softly at that, then broke into open laughter. I played along outwardly, but deep down I couldn't stop cursing under my breath. The last thing I'd expected was for the clan head to show up personally to take the grimoire. His presence was overwhelming, the most powerful mage I had ever faced. Soon, the clan head's laughter faded, and his tone turned ice cold. Killing me and reclaiming the grimoire would be the most straightforward option, but he'd rather have me back in Declan. If I handed over the grimoire, he said, every past transgression would be wiped clean. He praised my extraordinary talent, said that after seeing the way I fought, he only regretted not discovering me sooner. He even mentioned that I was nothing but a wanderer from the gray zone, trained only in the crude techniques of a crisis specialist, yet I had come this far. He claimed that with Declan behind me, I could fly higher and become truly unstoppable. He urged me to walk alongside him toward a greater future, to help make Declan even more powerful, and promised I would go down in history. I pretended to think it over and gave a quiet nod. The clan head immediately lit up, and just as he was about to bring up the grimoire, I cut him off with a raised hand. With a deliberate edge in my voice, I told him that if he was willing to hand over the position of clan head to me, then maybe I'd consider it. And I added, hadn't he said he'd seen me fight? He might not even be able to count how many people I'd put down with that move. At that, the clan head's expression darkened instantly. His voice pressed down with crushing force as he warned me, push this further and I might not make it out alive. I thought to myself, since he'd found me ahead of time, there was no choice but to go all in. If I could take revenge, all the better. If not, at least I'd die on my own terms, chasing the freedom I'd always wanted. With that, my eyes sharpened, and I launched the first strike. The clan head reacted instantly, throwing up a defense to block my assault. I had a burning fire inside me. I wanted to find out who was stronger. The clan head let out a cold snort, saying it looked like he'd need to teach me a real lesson. The moment those words left his mouth, he unleashed a wave of devastating magic. I fought back with everything I had, but I was still struggling. In a brief glance downward, I caught a flicker of cold contempt hidden in the clan head's eyes. Worthy of the Declan clan head, not a single opening in his offense or defense. The clan head said my mind was too cluttered. He brought up the foolish idea I'd thrown out moments ago, said that sometimes you don't need to fight to know the difference in strength. Between the two of us, the gap was as vast as heaven and earth. Then he asked if I could see things clearly now, and whether I was ready to have a proper talk. I forced myself to endure the searing pain coursing through my body, teeth clenched. Bow my head and admit defeat? Never going to happen. Go back to Declan? Not in a million years. Hand over the grimoire? Absolutely out of the question. Seeing me fall silent, the clan head's tone eased slightly, and in that exact moment of his letting his guard down, I pushed through the pain and struck without warning, screaming that I had long since grown sick and tired of being Declan's dog. No matter how gilded the collar, how spacious the room, it was still a kennel that kept me caged. I would rather die than go back. The clan head's face went cold, and he snapped at me, calling me a fool. He swiftly conjured a defensive spell, blocking every single attack I threw at him. He said coldly that he'd show me what it truly meant to be crushed. The next instant, a thunderous roar tore through the air. a far more ferocious force came surging toward me. 1,000 bolts of lightning intertwined, as if they'd reduce me to cinders at any moment. Through the blinding pain, memories from the past suddenly crashed over me. It wasn't just the freedom I envied in the wyvern soaring through the sky. It was the deep, blood-soaked grudge between me and the Declan clan. The clan head's voice came from ahead. He said he'd expected me to be dead by now, but hadn't thought I'd still be clinging to a breath. He admitted I was indeed strong, and for that reason he was willing to spare my life. I steadied my breathing and asked if he wanted me to keep working as Declan's crisis management specialist. The clan head raised an eyebrow and said he hadn't been clear enough just now. What he actually meant was for me to become the clan head of a vassal family under Declan. I laughed inwardly. He wanted me to lead a clan in service of Declan. In the end, it was just the same dog on a different leash. I slowly reached into my robe and pulled out the grimoire. I asked if that was really what he was after all along, and as I said it, I held the grimoire out toward him. The clan head's face brightened and he said from now on, I'd stand alongside Declan and share its endless glory. But in the very next moment, I raised my hand and set the grimoire on fire. The clan head's voice dropped sharply, demanding to know what I was doing. I said flatly that if he didn't mind, he was welcome to take back what was left of the ashes. The clan head's eyes turned glacial, and he said I was clearly determined to meet an ugly end. I cut him off and told him to be quiet for a moment. Then I asked him, did he know about those crisis management specialists who had been devoured by the young Declan heir? The clan head's expression shifted slightly as he uttered the words, forbidden magic. I went on to say that every person the young heir had consumed was one of my comrades, and the Declan clan had chosen to bury it all without a trace. I had wanted to help them accomplish what they set out to do, but even lives as cheap as grass cannot be trampled on at will. Even if we were as insignificant as ants, I had a spine I refused to bend. He said he would remember my last words, then lightly flicked his fingers, telling me to spend my final moments reflecting on the choice I'd made. The next instant, a massive blue flame surged toward me, and searing agony consumed every inch of my body. That was the blue fire the Declan clan took such pride in. Once it touched you, it would never go out. But I only laughed harder and wilder, screaming. Reflect on what? I'd rather crawl back to the gray zone and scrape by than return to Declan as their lapdog. And even if I couldn't make it back to the gray zone, dying like this wasn't so bad. This feeling of breaking free from every last chain, I hadn't felt it in so long. Even if I hadn't managed to escape Declan while still alive, I had no regrets. If I were given another life as a human being, I would find my freedom in the next one and take revenge for my fallen comrades and for the person I was in this life. Then all of a sudden, the flame stopped. I hadn't died, and the entire world had gone still. Even stranger, the grimoire I had just burned with my own hands had restored itself. It slowly floated up into the air and poured a surge of golden magical energy into me. A burst of golden light exploded outward. When I opened my eyes again, a gold coin had suddenly dropped in front of me. An overwhelming sense of familiarity washed over me. I instinctively looked around in every direction. How had the surroundings completely changed? When my gaze landed on the begging bowl in front of me, it all came rushing back. This was the gray zone, the place where I had lived before becoming Declan's crisis management specialist, surviving on nothing but begging. Everything around me was exactly as I remembered. I ran to the nearest water source and stared at my reflection in the surge river. It was me, no doubt, but the face looking back was the one I had as a child. The only thing unchanged was the mark on my chest where the grimoire had bound itself. I had no idea exactly how any of this had happened, but it all had to be connected to that grimoire. There had never been much information about it to begin with, and yet it turned out to be capable of reversing time itself. If this was a dream, it was far too vivid to be one. Even that familiar foul stench from the surge river felt completely real. But whatever the case, being alive again was the greatest stroke of luck imaginable. The situation before me seemed to be hinting that no matter what I did from here on, I would succeed. So then, what kind of life could truly be called a success? I once had a dream. No, it wasn't just my dream, it was the shared wish of the comrades I had already lost. A long-buried memory suddenly surfaced. I remembered what one of them once said, that we were all wanderers who had come out of the gray zone, born with nothing and given no chance to gain knowledge. He asked me what hurt me most, and without a second thought I said going hungry. But he shook his head and said, if it were just about going hungry, we wouldn't have ended up selling our lives for others. He asked again why I thought our lives had turned out so miserable. I shrugged and said things weren't so bad now. Seeing him glare at me with real anger, I quickly dropped the attitude and gestured for him to go on. He drew a deep breath and spoke with rare sincerity. Not being able to learn was the greatest regret of his life. If they had been able to gain knowledge and skills as children, they would never have been seized by those born into powerful families, and they would never have ended up living lives that weren't their own. So he said, if he ever managed to leave Declan someday, he wanted to. The memory cut off there, but I remembered clearly. What he had wanted was to build a library, a place where anyone could walk in freely to read, regardless of wealth, status, gender, or age. But I was going to take it one step further. I would build a tower. A tower not only for collecting books from every corner of the world, but also as a sanctuary for all who hungered for knowledge, a place where they could learn in peace. And on top of that, I would place the Declan clan secret texts at the entrance of the first floor, so that wanderers from the gray zone, illegitimate sons of noble families, butchers from the meat stalls, every ordinary person could pick one up with ease. And on the cover of every book in that tower, I would stamp the Declan family crest. Inside those covers would be the very secret text they had guarded more jealously than their own lives. Just as I was happily lost in visions of the future, someone suddenly kicked me hard in the face. I lost my balance and hit the ground, and then the leader of the begging gang started beating and screaming at me. I forced myself to endure the pain racking my body as my eyes went cold. I reached out and seized the foot he swung at me again. He froze for a moment, then erupted into even greater fury, roaring that I dared to fight back. I told him he had kicked me 7 times, and now I was going to return it tenfold. The leader had never seen me resist before, and for a brief moment he didn't know how to react. He took my punch clean, but the moment my fist landed, a sharp pain shot through my wrist. I'd sprained it. Then he slammed his fist hard into my face. He raged at me, demanding to know who gave me the guts to raise a hand against him. How could I be this useless? More than the physical pain, the blow to my pride stung far worse. Just then, his foot caught a stone beneath him. His body lurched, and he took a full tumble, rolling straight down the slope and into the river beside us. I seized the opening immediately and bolted. To be clear, this was not simply running away. It was a strategic withdrawal. As I ran, gasping for breath, I kept a silent count of exactly how many hits that guy had gotten in. I was a battle-hardened crisis management specialist. I was not about to accept this kind of loss lying down. I ducked into a narrow back alley and winced as I looked over my wounds. One punch and I'd already sprained my wrist. My body as a kid was completely hopeless. To make things worse, my stomach chose that exact moment to start growling. The next second, a young voice piped up and asked if I was hungry. I snapped my head up to find a white-haired boy standing in front of me. I went on high alert instantly, sizing him up in silence. The kid was dirty from head to toe, but the clothes he was wearing were clearly expensive. In other words, he was a walking target, a living bomb that could bring trouble at any moment. Before I could think any further, he suddenly started introducing himself. I inwardly rolled my eyes. This kid had to have a few screws loose, going around telling his name to strangers in a place like this. When I said nothing, he murmured quietly that his mother was already gone. Hearing that, I blurted out an apology on instinct, then scrambled to recover by saying both my parents were dead too, so I had it worse. I knew full well that getting tangled up with a bomb like this was asking for trouble. The smart move was to send him on his way before he brought any down on me. So I put on my most impatient expression and waved him off, telling him to go home already. But instead, he held out his small hand and said he wanted to help heal my injuries. And as he said it, he raised his hand and began casting healing magic on me. I watched in stunned silence. The white-haired kid smiled and said a little touch would fix me right up. I thought to myself, injuries this real don't just get fixed up with a touch. But the very next second, a soft, warm glow of healing light wrapped around my wounds, and a wave of warmth spread through me instantly. It hit me all at once. This was healing magic from the secret texts of the Brando family, one of the noble houses that had fallen from grace because of Declan. Every instinct I'd sharpened as a crisis management specialist blared a warning in the same breath. Just now, I felt like I'd been unwillingly dragged into something deeply dirty and dangerous. But why would a highborn young lord of the Brando family be out here in the lawless gray zone? Going by the timeline, the Brando family at this point in history should still have been at the height of its power. I set my questions aside and gave him a simple thank you. But the moment I got a clear look at his eyes, my mind went completely blank. He had the heterochromatic eyes of the Brando family's legitimate heir. It all came rushing back. Before I was reborn, I had gone on a mission to the Brando estate with a group of comrades. At the time, I had complained that it was just a routine assignment. Was it really worth deploying this much firepower? One of my comrades explained that it was because the Brando family had produced a monster, someone who could cut down dozens of high-ranking mages completely on their own without breaking a sweat. When we finally reached the Brando estate, I witnessed something I would never forget for the rest of my life. Monster wasn't nearly enough of a word to describe it. The legitimate heir of the Brando family, with his mismatched eyes, was completely unhinged. With a grotesque smile on his face, he tore people apart with his bare hands, while simultaneously casting the Brando family's signature recovery magic over and over again. No one could get near him. A truly unkillable, frenzied killing machine. And yet the white-haired boy right in front of me was crouched on the ground, completely absorbed in counting ants. Could this really be the same person? Suddenly, his own stomach let out a growl too. He stood up and invited me to go eat with him. The white-haired boy said his mother always told him you had to eat well to stay healthy, and that I must have gotten hurt because I wasn't eating enough. I stood up and brushed myself off, then asked him bluntly whether he had any money. He immediately pulled a bulging pouch from his pocket and opened it, packed with coins. He might not necessarily become that kind of monster in the future, but right now, filling my stomach was what mattered most. I walked over and threw an arm around his shoulder, gave a thumbs up, and said with a grin that we were friends. And I made a special point of reminding him, the most important thing between friends was knowing how to share. The white-haired boy nodded obediently, quietly repeating the word friends. As we walked, I asked the white-haired boy what else he had besides money. He tilted his head with an innocent look and said he had a friend, and somehow those words hit different. That meal was one of the most satisfying I could remember having in a long time. Afterward, I got a hot bath and felt completely at ease. I noticed the white-haired boy glancing around the restaurant curiously, so I asked him what he was looking for. He said he hadn't realized there were rooms upstairs, and added that he used to sleep outside every single night. This was the first time he knew a restaurant could also be a place to stay. He suddenly seemed to remember something and turned to me with a serious expression, saying he also didn't have a father. I paused for a moment. By this point in time, both the Brando clan head and his wife should still have been alive. Wait, why was he comparing notes with me on this? Were we competing over who had it worse? worse? But he explained earnestly that they weren't here, and if they weren't here, it was the same as not having them at all. That was quite a way of looking at things. I figured I should just ask him what was going on. He said that since escaping from his family, he had slept 10 times. Some days he napped twice in the afternoon, so all told it added up to 10 sleeps. By that math, he had been wandering around here for roughly 3 or 4 days. But why had he run away in the first place? Was someone out to kill him? He said there were always people chasing him. His answers never quite lined up. No wonder. Someone clearly unhinged starts being wired differently from the rest of us from a young age. I decided to protect him for the time being. For one, I could use him to forge a connection with the Brando family. When the time came to take revenge on Declan, he might prove useful. And two, a family of that standing was bound to have a wealth of rare books, which would be a great asset to my plan to build a tower and fill it with knowledge. Of course, the first thing I needed to deal with right now was the first score I had to settle since my rebirth. I told the white-haired boy that I was going to lie down and train, so he should sit still and not touch me, and warned him that something bad would happen if he did. The white-haired boy tilted his head and asked whether I was starting my breathing practice. I nodded and told him that once I was done training, I'd teach him to do it too. In my past life, the standard issue secret texts Declan provided to US crisis management specialists were grounded in magic but had obvious limits. That was exactly why I had risked my life back then to infiltrate various powerful noble families and steal their secret texts. It was that accumulation that gave me mastery of a wide range of rare techniques, including the steel body arts used by knights, as well as elven arts, summoning arts, alchemy, and more. I had dabbled in all kinds of secret text knowledge, but in my past life, in those final moments before death, what I had felt was a power that could tear heaven and earth apart like a natural disaster. Because of that, in this life, I was still firmly committed to walking the path of magic. And what I was about to train in right now was Declan's foundational technique, a method capable of absorbing magic of all attributes, the very root of all Declan's secret texts. It was remarkable that everything I had memorized in my past life while studying Declan was coming in handy now. The moment I began the breathing technique, a scorching heat swept through my entire body. It was as if molten lava was tearing through every channel inside me, burning through each and every meridian. I forced my mind steady, telling myself over and over that I had to stay focused. Wait, those things drifting through my magic circuits, could those be magic impurities? It suddenly hit me. This was a secret technique known only to the most powerful mages in a certain noble family. A method performed exclusively for the family's direct bloodline, by channeling magic to burn away the impurities accumulated in the magic circuits and clear them out entirely. This technique was known as magic purification. I had no idea how much time had passed when I jolted awake from my training. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up. I turned to look. The white-haired boy was fast asleep, completely out. But more than that, what struck me was that all the impurities in my magic circuits had completely vanished, and my magical energy had become extraordinarily pure, a purity even greater than what I had achieved at the peak of my past life. Even so, I was well aware that defeating the Declan clan head was something that, even with 100 reincarnations, would still be next to impossible. But I could equally say with certainty that the odds were better now than they had ever been in my past life. I had always been a battle-hardened crisis management specialist. Even when the odds were nearly zero, I had never been one to give up easily. First thing the next morning, I put together a disguise for the white-haired boy. After switching into plain commoner's clothes, he exclaimed with delight that his hair had turned brown. I picked up a hat nearby and pulled it down over his head, completely covering his unmistakably bright white gold hair. That should be enough to keep anyone from recognizing him as a child of the Brando family. The white-haired boy tugged at the hem of my clothes, asking excitedly what we were doing next. I curved my lips into a grin and told him we were going to go beat up some bad guys. By then, the begging gang had surely already woken up. Their reaction when they spotted me was exactly as expected, insults or mockery without fail. They also stared at the white-haired boy and asked who this little kid was, saying he looked pretty well off. Without a word, I stepped forward and threw a solid punch, and knocked the begging gang's leader flat on the ground. I stood over him and told him coldly that this punch was just the start. He owed me 123 more, and I would collect every single one. People began gathering around, all the same ones who had bullied me back when I was little. I stared them down, and all I could think was that I couldn't even imagine how badly I was going to rough them up today. The white-haired boy clapped enthusiastically, asking what fun game we were playing. I grinned and told him we were playing a game called Divine Fists. The words had barely left my mouth before I charged into the crowd and started swinging. Left hook, right hook, throwing punch after punch, no mercy whatsoever. The white-haired boy gasped in awe beside me, showering me with praise for my fighting skills. In between punches, I called over to him, saying that in a moment like this, the right thing to shout was, "That's freaking awesome." The white-haired boy immediately hollered at the top of his lungs, "That's freaking awesome." I explained to him that the rules of this game were simple. I was in charge of beating people up, he was in charge of healing them. We could keep this going for a long, long time. The white-haired boy nodded dutifully, and every time he saw someone drop in front of him, he would immediately cast his healing magic. The first guy hadn't even realized what was happening yet. Before his thank you could leave his lips, I yanked him back to his feet and told him that since he was all healed up, it was time for another round. From morning straight through to the afternoon, I put every single one of them on the ground, with a special dose of punishment reserved for the begging gang leader who had just been roughing me up. But he never could quite keep track of exactly how many times I'd hit him. The white-haired boy watched with undisguised excitement and rushed over to ask if it was his turn to join in. I gave a nod, then turned back back to the begging gang leader and reminded him that he still owed me a full 123 punches. The man immediately burst into wailing, cursing us both as demons and claiming he couldn't even count past 2 digits. By the time the beating was over, the sky had gone completely dark. The white-haired boy and I stood side by side before the crowd, while the members of the begging gang trembled in fear before us. The white-haired boy still looked like he hadn't had nearly enough and said we should play this game together again next time. I did the math in my head. Each of them had taken at least 100 hits. Added together, that was over 2,000 punches in total. The debts from my childhood had been paid in full. One of them shuffled forward nervously and said they thought they'd taken enough hits. This was their home, he said tentatively. So could the two of us maybe head out now? I drew the words out deliberately and asked if that meant they were telling us to get lost. The man frantically waved his hands in denial. If anyone was leaving, it was them, and they'd get out right away. I was sending them away not out of resentment, but because I genuinely couldn't let them stay. Because something in the distance was closing in fast. Whatever it was moved at incredible speed and was unnervingly quiet, almost certainly a pursuer. My heart sank. I thought I'd been careful enough, but how had they managed to track us down? I quietly took stock of the magic I had left, and the situation wasn't looking good. Between the training and the fighting earlier, what remained wasn't nearly enough to cast any serious spells. I couldn't even sustain a prolonged close-quarters fight. But then I thought back to my days as a crisis management specialist. My magic had never been fully charged. It was precisely because I had spent years operating on next to nothing that this kind of tight spot was nothing new to me. I focused inward, gathering every last trace of magic I had left. I knew there was only one chance, so I compressed everything into a single concentrated point. I positioned myself squarely between the white-haired boy and whoever was coming, locked onto the direction of the approaching presence. But what happened next left me completely frozen. The figure suddenly dropped to their knees in front of us with a heavy thud. I immediately pulled back the magic I had coiled to its absolute limit. The person was wailing hysterically, calling out again and again for young master. The white-haired boy's face changed in an instant, and he stammered out the butler's name. The butler clutched the white-haired boy and broke down in tears, saying he had been searching everywhere, asking how the boy had been surviving all this time, and confessing he hadn't slept a single night for worrying about his safety. The white-haired boy pulled free from his grip and stepped back, making it clear he was not going home with him. But the butler's voice was firm as he said that if the boy refused to come back, he would have to step over his dead body, because he was not letting go. Only then did it dawn on me. The white-haired boy wasn't being hunted down. He had simply run away from home. The butler turned to face me and said with some embarrassment that he had been quite a spectacle in front of a guest, then introduced himself as the Brando family's butler. I smiled back and politely told him my name. The butler smiled and said the white-haired boy seemed very fond of me, then extended an invitation for me to come back to the Brando estate with them. Noble families had always looked down on those of impure birth and low standing, so why was this butler inviting me so willingly? I couldn't quite work out what he was thinking, but it didn't really matter, since I'd intended to use my connection with the white-haired boy to get close to the Brando family anyway. This was working out perfectly in my favor. On top of that, the Brando estate sat right at the entrance to the road leading to Hejian City, where the East's foremost institution, Genuine Academy, was located, home to the largest library in the entire eastern region. I nodded and accepted, saying I looked forward to his hospitality. It deviated slightly from my original plan to build my own library, but going to the Brando estate for a look couldn't hurt. Besides, I was curious whether the food there was any good. The butler let out a relieved sigh and told us to wait a moment while he arranged for a carriage. The following evening, we arrived at the white-haired boy's home. I stepped down from the carriage alongside him and looked up at the grand structure standing before me. It occurred to me quietly that this was the first time I had ever set foot in a proper noble estate. The butler led us inside, saying it was getting late and we should both rest, and asked a nearby maid to look after us. The maid called out the white-haired boy's name in a sharp, cold tone. The moment he saw her, all the color drained from his face. He backed away, stammering that he knew he was in trouble. The maid first got me settled into a guest room, then immediately hauled the white-haired boy back to his own quarters. Meanwhile, the butler was making his way to the study. He reached the door, knocked, and was permitted to enter. The butler bowed before the Brando family matriarch and reported that the young master had been found in the 7th gray zone. The moment she heard the words 7th gray zone, the matriarch's voice shot up sharply. She unleashed her power in a furious burst, demanding to know whether her son was all right, and swearing that if a single hair on his head was harmed, she would not let it go. The butler quickly moved to calm her, asking her to settle down and hear him out first. He then went through the whole story of how he'd found the white-haired boy in full detail. The matriarch reigned in her power, and her voice gradually steadied. The butler exhaled inwardly with relief. It was fortunate the boy hadn't been seriously hurt, and even more fortunate that the matriarch had calmed down. This woman, once feared throughout the land as the Blood Witch, when consumed by rage, there was no one capable of stopping her, especially when it came to anything involving her son. She had always been liable to act first and think later. The fact that nothing had gone seriously wrong this time was genuinely a stroke of luck in an otherwise bad situation. The matriarch thanked the butler for his hard work, and he bowed humbly, saying it was simply his duty. Then the butler added that something rather unusual had happened during the visit to bring the young master home. The friend the young master had made while away was no ordinary person, something he needed to bring to her attention. He told her that I had detected his presence, and had already prepared to counterattack before he even appeared. It was only once he got close that he realized what I had gathered in my hand was actually a magic bullet. Hearing that, the white-haired boy's mother couldn't help but fall deep in thought. To think that a place as rough and lawless as the Gray Zone was hiding a child with talent like this. The butler beside her kept marveling aloud, saying how wonderful it would be if I could serve the Brando family. Finally, he composed himself and made a solemn request of the matriarch. The very next morning came in no time. I had barely finished washing up and stepped out of my room before the butler was already blocking the doorway. He said he wanted to make me his successor. For a street kid like me, it was the perfect chance to turn my life around. He was sure I couldn't possibly say no. But the moment I heard those words, I couldn't stop myself from letting out a curse. The butler thought he had misheard. He quickly pressed me to clarify what I meant. Just then, the white-haired boy suddenly popped up from the side and asked curiously what I had just said. I quickly covered his mouth, then turned to the butler and gave a respectful bow, thanking him, but said I had no interest in the offer and could only apologize for turning it down. The butler stood there, completely stunned. Then he launched into a lecture. With the weight of a life lesson, he told me the world was a vast place. I replied flatly that it certainly wasn't small. He added that I probably thought I could one day have the whole world under my feet. I shook my head and told him that thought had never once crossed my mind. That response left the butler momentarily speechless. I could sense him forcibly swallowing his rising frustration. He changed his approach and gave an example. Goblins never leave their canyons, so they have no idea how dangerous the world outside really is. I looked over at him and calmly said I thought of myself more as a wyvern. That did it. Those words set the butler's temper ablaze. He couldn't hold it in any longer. He raised his voice and snapped at me, saying I simply didn't understand. He declared he would personally show me just how vast and terrifying the world could be. With that, he turned and led me off in one direction without another word. He brought me to a building and pushed open a heavy set of doors. The moment those inside caught sight of the butler walking in, they immediately gathered around and bowed in unison to greet him. The butler introduced them as people around my age, all individuals whose talents had been recognized by the family. I quickly swept my gaze across the room. The Brando family did have something to be proud of. These people carried themselves with the ease of seasoned fighters, and a powerful air surrounded them all. Yet when I looked more closely at their eyes, what I found there was nothing but timidity and submission. Turns out they were the ones trapped in the canyon, goblins, through and through. I looked away, and the butler said that with my abilities, I would surely outshine every single one of them in time. I shook my head again and said with a light laugh that I didn't particularly like the spotlight. Just then, someone in the crowd suddenly raised a hand and called out to the head butler. The butler looked toward the voice and asked what the senior trainee had to say. The senior trainee said with full confidence that I still hadn't truly grasped my own place in the world. From his perspective, it was simply because I hadn't yet felt the gap between me and everyone else in the room. So he asked the butler for permission to let me experience what real magic looked like firsthand. The butler raised an eyebrow, considered it briefly, and gave an approving nod, saying it was a fine idea. Then, in a tone that was clearly leading me somewhere, he asked whether I'd be willing to spar with the senior trainee. I saw right through it. These trainees had already marked me as a thorn in their side. Given that, I had no choice but to shut them up with results, so I said I'd choose my own opponent to spar with. Once the butler agreed, I raised my hand and pointed at the senior trainee, then pointed to 4 others in turn, and said I wanted all 5 of them to come at me at once. I threw in one last remark. If they were too scared to step up, they could just admit it in front of everyone. The butler was taken aback for a moment, then found himself genuinely intrigued. But what I was doing amounted to insulting the Brando family, and he asked whether I could take responsibility for my words. I replied evenly that I was prepared to take full responsibility. The butler then laid out the terms. If I could hold on for 1 minute, I'd earn a prize. If I couldn't, there would be consequences. Consequences was really just a polished way of saying he'd force me into taking his position as successor. This sly old man thought he could lead me around by the nose. Far too naive of him. Our group made its way to the sparring arena. The instructor on the side rushed forward to intervene, but the butler waved it off, saying a little tempering would do my attitude good. The instructor had no interest in bearing responsibility for putting the young master's friend in harm's way. So when the white-haired boy appeared, he hurried over to explain the situation and begged him to step in and stop it. The white-haired boy's eyes lit up immediately, and he said excitedly that he wanted to join in too. The instructor's composure crumbled on the spot, and he let out an involuntary "oh, for heaven's sake." The maid standing nearby reminded the white-haired boy that getting swept up in the chaos would earn him a scolding from the matriarch. By this point, the butler was visibly losing patience and snapped at the instructor. The instructor didn't dare defy his superior and could only agree with a pained expression. The maid glanced at the commotion and told the white-haired boy she'd be back shortly. She made a point of telling him not to join in while she was gone. The white-haired boy gave a dutiful nod that didn't quite convince anyone. The instructor cleared his throat and began laying out the sparring rules, rounds-based format. But before he could finish, the butler cut him off and said just make it an all-out elimination match. The instructor had no choice but to revise on the spot. It would end when one side surrendered voluntarily, and he would step in to stop things as he saw fit. I watched the expressions on their faces and could feel their hostility with complete clarity. The senior trainee in particular had a look in his eyes that was full of cold menace. What a shame. To me, dealing with them was no different from chopping through cabbages. The instructor drew a sharp breath and announced the start of the match. The moment the signal dropped, I moved. One strike, and the senior trainee was completely neutralized. The sudden blow hit him so hard he couldn't even draw breath. He had no time to react at all, and the other four alongside him were already flat on the ground. I walked up unhurriedly to the senior trainee and looked down at him from above. I said with a smile that he was the one who truly needed this experience. First, I told him to remember rule number 1, never judge a book by its cover. The senior trainee stared wide-eyed at the force I had gathered in my hand, but said dismissively that it was nothing but the most basic application of magical energy, completely useless in actual combat. I went on to deliver rule number 2, never rush to make judgments about others. The words had barely left my mouth before the magic bullet found its mark on all 5 of them with perfect precision. Then I reached out and grabbed him by the collar, and told them rule number 3, the world is wide. Knowing your place in it is what matters most. With that, I sent the senior trainee flying with one punch. I told the 5 of them lying on the ground to reflect carefully on these invaluable lessons. The senior trainee scrambled to his feet in a fury and accused me of not using real magic. I stepped forward and kicked him even farther away, telling him clearly that was exactly what magic looked like. Then I added one final note. It was physical magic, to be precise. The instructor stood rooted to the spot, completely blindsided by what he had just witnessed. Every other trainee watching had gone wide-eyed and silent, not a single one daring to make a sound. Even the butler beside them was left speechless. He had never expected me to wrap up the sparring match in such a swift and decisive fashion. What surprised him even more was that the magic bullet I had used just now had been compressed at least 5 times. He was quietly shaken. If I had turned that on him the first time we met, the outcome would have been unthinkable. He had deep respect for the extraordinary talent I demonstrated in controlling magical energy, and he couldn't help but marvel inwardly that my skill at beating people up was something else entirely. Nearby, the white-haired boy was still enthusiastically casting healing magic on the injured. Just then, the voice of the Brando family matriarch carried over from a distance. The butler stiffened instantly and turned to bow with full deference. The instructor looked up and saw the Brando matriarch approaching. He turned to the maid at his side with a look of deep relief and gratitude. He thought to himself, thank goodness he was saved. The white-haired boy's mother scanned the wreckage scattered across the ground and asked with a frown what had happened. The butler explained that he had simply intended to run a quick ability test on me. The Brando matriarch let out a slow sigh. First, she called out to the white-haired boy to go back to his room and rest. Then she instructed the butler to take the injured to be treated. The butler acknowledged the order without hesitation. The white-haired boy scratched his head with a slightly sulky expression. Then he ran over to me and told his mother he was bringing me along. The Brando matriarch said nothing, only shifting her gaze to the instructor standing to the side. Then, in a cool and level tone, she announced that the instructor was dismissed. Evening fell and the lights in the study gradually came to life. The butler stood in respectful contrition, offering repeated apologies to the matriarch. The Brando matriarch wasn't unsympathetic to his good intentions in trying to recruit talent for the family, but the way he had gone about it this time had clearly crossed a line. The butler expressed that he was willing to accept whatever punishment was given. After delivering a light reprimand, the matriarch asked whether the white-haired boy had played any part in it. The butler gave an honest account. I had handled the entire match on my own. The white-haired boy had only used healing magic on the injured trainees. He then added with a more serious expression that I had also used a magic bullet during the sparring match, but the one I used had been compressed at least 5 times, significantly amplifying its power. The Brando matriarch gave a thoughtful nod at that. It meant I had an exceptional gift for precise control over magical energy. To put it in perspective, even accomplished mages of high standing found it extraordinarily difficult to control raw magical energy directly, rather than channeling it through fixed magical forms. The Brando matriarch pivoted and asked the butler about having proposed the successor position to me. The butler replied with a pained expression that my stance had been unwavering. I had refused clearly every time. The Brando matriarch took that in with quiet understanding, then instructed the butler to invite me into the study. When I walked into the study, I immediately saw the Brando matriarch and the white-haired boy seated together on the sofa. Following the matriarch's gesture, I took a seat and asked directly what she wanted to speak with me about. She first handed me an elegantly crafted box. Before getting to the real matter, she said this was the prize the butler had promised, delivered on his behalf. I paused for a moment before it registered. I hadn't expected the promise to actually be honored, let alone that the Brando matriarch herself had prepared it. The Brando matriarch gestured for me to open the box and take a look. I reached out and gently lifted the lid. Nestled quietly inside was a top-grade spirit medicine. My heart gave a jolt. This was something only core members of the Brando 5 Great Mage Corps were entitled to possess. I silently turned it over in my mind. As a reward for a bet, there had to be more to this. The Brando matriarch told me to accept it without worry, noting that I had helped the white-haired boy back in the gray zone. And beyond that, she said it was also her personal apology on behalf of the butler's reckless behavior earlier. I was still uneasy and couldn't help asking whether taking it would obligate me to join the Brando family. The Brando matriarch shook her head. I ventured another guess. The thing wasn't poisoned, was it? She denied it again, putting my concern to rest. I still couldn't quite bring myself to believe it and confirmed one more time that there were truly no conditions attached. The Brando matriarch said firmly there were none. It was simply a gift, nothing more. In that case, I'd accept it gratefully. This was quite an unexpected windfall. The Brando matriarch continued, saying that along with the gift, there was also a proposal she'd like to put to me. As she spoke, she reached over and gently patted the white-haired boy on the head. She asked whether I would be willing to enroll at Genuine Academy alongside him. She added that he was actually supposed to have started the previous year, but he had been fiercely resistant to attending, which is why it had been pushed to this year. She admitted she hadn't anticipated he would actually run away from home over this, and so she wanted to formally make the request. After all, he had made it very clear that as long as I was with him, he'd go to school without a fuss. From a mother's point of view, this was genuinely a tricky situation. If she forced him to go, she worried he'd run away again, and she had no other way to get him to attend willingly. Of course, from my perspective, this was also a rare opportunity. Forging those academic connections would benefit my future plans enormously. I considered my response carefully, saying I would think it over. The Brando matriarch didn't press me, only asking that I let her know once I'd made up my mind. She then asked why I had turned down the butler's proposal about becoming his successor. I glanced over at the butler standing to the side, and couldn't help laughing. I said lightly that it was because my knees were too important, so becoming anyone's successor was simply out of the question. At that, the Brando matriarch looked genuinely puzzled. The butler frowned as well and asked in confusion what I meant by that. I offered no further explanation. As the sky gradually darkened, I said my goodbyes and returned to my room. As expected of a top-grade spirit medicine, I had only absorbed a tenth of it, and my magical energy had already improved noticeably, perhaps due to the grimoire's mark on my body. My constitution seemed to have undergone some kind of change. The effect of this medicine had far surpassed anything I had anticipated. Though I'd said I needed time to think about the academy, I had already made up my mind. Going there would let me study, fulfill the wish my comrades had carried, and make it much easier to find patrons for the tower I intended to build. So when the time was right, I'd give the Brando matriarch my answer. As it happened, the moment I stepped out of my room, a young man was leaning against the doorframe. I sized him up quietly. Platinum blonde hair, amber eyes. He had to be the white-haired boy's older cousin. He called out my name. I deliberately denied who I was. He said flatly that he hadn't mistaken me for anyone else, and pointed out that I had short black hair, and those eyes of mine that somehow managed to look deeply disagreeable. I deliberately blinked and put on the most innocent expression I could manage. The young man paused, then admitted that looking at me now, I actually seemed kind of nice. He promptly apologized and said he'd be on his way. Just as the young man was about to leave, the butler suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Still on his knees, he asked me what on earth I was playing at. I twitched slightly. I was obviously teasing him about his habit of dropping to his knees at the slightest thing. More importantly, my little lie had just been blown wide open. The air went immediately awkward, and the young man turned back furious, accusing me of actually daring to deceive him. He also said my sullen, arrogant eyes were as off-putting as a dead goblin. He declared he was definitely going to give me a good thrashing. At that very moment, the butler who had been kneeling suddenly rose to his feet. His eyes sharpened in an instant. The young man's movements froze on the spot, and his bravado deflated just as quickly. He shot me one last seething glare and told me to find him at the magic hall tomorrow. After the young man left, the butler's expression eased, and he asked what had just happened. I brushed it off and said it was nothing, though inwardly I was buzzing. Someone had come looking for trouble all on their own. How convenient. Just wait, I thought. I'd make sure to teach this kid a proper lesson when the time came. I turned back to the butler and made it clear once again that refusing his offer had nothing to do with anything else. I simply wasn't interested. Then I asked him to arrange for me to meet with the matriarch the following morning. I arrived at the study as planned. The Brando matriarch looked up when she saw me enter, setting her writing brush down. She asked whether I had already made my decision. I gave a respectful bow and said I had thought it through. I was willing to go to the academy with the white-haired boy. The Brando matriarch was visibly surprised. She hadn't expected me to decide so quickly. Then a look of quiet satisfaction crossed her face, and she said she would arrange the enrollment as soon as possible. I bowed again, thanking her for her consideration. I also understood perfectly well that by accepting this favor from the Brando matriarch, I would need to repay the debt at the right moment. But I didn't mind this kind of mutually beneficial arrangement, and besides, I genuinely liked the white-haired boy as a friend. He was the very first friend I had made since my rebirth. After I left the study, the butler came in at a quick pace. He couldn't contain his excitement as he thanked the Brando matriarch. He went on to comment that there was a burning eagerness for the future shining in my eyes. The Brando matriarch glanced up at him. The butler, mistaking her attention for interest in the topic, grew even more animated and launched into his analysis. He said the first semester would go smoothly for me since the Brando family was covering the tuition, but the second semester would be a different story. After all, I was a wanderer from the gray zone. Scraping together expensive tuition fees would surely be next to impossible. Once that moment arrived, he could step in with an outstretched hand and bring me firmly into the fold. The Brando matriarch's brow furrowed, and she told him he was being far too loud. The butler realized he had overstepped and bowed in a hurry to apologize. He quickly scrambled to find a reason to leave, saying he'd go check on the lunch being prepared in the kitchen, and promptly backed out of the room. The Brando matriarch watched him go. She reflected that the butler had extended an olive branch to me time and again, only to be turned away each time. Even this new opportunity wasn't necessarily going to win me over. It was probably because the previous head butler had once brought him up through a similar approach, which was why he had such confidence it would work. At the same time, I had already arrived at the magic hall. I was someone who kept my word. The young man from the Brando branch family who had picked a fight with me was in there waiting. I walked to the far end of the hall, where a robed figure came forward to greet me. I had forgotten to ask for his name earlier, so I had no choice but to describe the young man's features from memory. The moment I finished, the person understood immediately and told me I was looking for the vice director of the magic hall's younger brother. He added that the person was already waiting inside and told me to follow him. He left led me to a closed door and said this was the way in. He also made a specific point of warning me to mind my head once the door was open. I reached out curiously and pushed the door open, and immediately understood what he meant. Inside the room, pages of paper were swirling through the air in every direction, raining down from above in a continuous shower. At this rate, one wrong move and I'd be buried in an avalanche of paper. Then a composed voice spoke from within the room, and its owner stepped out from behind towering stacks of books and introduced himself. I inwardly clicked my tongue. That kid had actually gone and brought his older brother in as backup. Thinking back to my past life, I had once infiltrated the Brando family's magic hall. The thing that had left the deepest impression on me was the mages there who devoted themselves to magical research. They all shared the same set of traits that came with being old scholars of the trade. First, their hair was remarkably sparse. The story went that it was from years of yanking at their hair whenever they hit a dead end in their research. After long enough, it simply stopped growing back properly. If you were to grade the stages of their hair loss, the first stage was draping a wide, oversized robe over their head to conceal the thinning. The second stage was simply letting the sparse patches show, coming to terms with reality. The third stage was shaving off whatever remained. The final stage was pouring all their energy into researching a magical method to regrow their hair, though no one had ever managed it. But the vice director standing before me looked nothing at all like my mental image of these mages. This one had a full head of thick hair, and appeared exceptionally young on top of that. He warmly invited me to sit down and have some tea. I bowed politely in thanks. As I lifted the teacup, I reflected that within the Brando family, high positions weren't simply handed out by bloodline. For someone this young to have already risen to vice director of the Magic Hall, he had to possess the absolute capability to match it. If he had been hostile toward me, I would have felt far more at ease. But here he was, smiling at me with evident goodwill, a warmth so mild and measured, I couldn't get a read on him at all. He offered his congratulations on my enrollment at Genuine Academy and mentioned that he himself was an alumnus. I thanked him, though internally I was mulling it over. This move to establish a connection as fellow students felt just a touch too deliberate. He seemed to pick up on my wariness and apologized with a hint of regret. He said that hearing I was also heading to his alma mater had made him a little too excited, and he had let himself get carried away. Then he shifted his tone, turning serious, and asked whether I was the kind of person who would put my life on the line for a friend. I wasn't sure what had prompted such a sudden question. He held my gaze with complete seriousness and said this matter concerned the very fate of the Brando family. If I could give him a definitive yes, he was prepared to give me a particular book. I looked down at the book he was handing across the table, and my pupils contracted sharply. It was the Brando family's core secret text, the Healing Light Codex. Meanwhile, the Brando matriarch was in the garden, quietly turning things over in her mind, while tending to the branches of her flowers. She murmured softly that the white-haired boy had finally agreed to go to school. A worry she had carried for so long could now be set down, at least a little. She thought to herself that I was genuinely impressive, and what struck her most was my exceptional talent. In terms of temperament, the butler had mentioned I could be rather bold at times, but on reflection, most children my age were exactly like that. A little impulsive, a little unpredictable. What satisfied her most, though, was that even after learning the white-haired boy's identity, my attitude toward him had never changed. She felt I was different from others, which was precisely why she felt comfortable leaving me by his side. But it was that very difference that told her, with certainty, that I would never be tied down by any one place, like a bird that longed for the open sky, one that no cage could ever hold. She calculated quietly that for the white-haired boy's sake, she couldn't afford to let someone like me slip away. She would need to think carefully about how to keep me close. Meanwhile, I was still puzzling over the vice director's intentions. He was actually willing to hand over his family's core secret text just like that. What was he really after? I found myself studying his eyes closely. They were clear and bright, without a trace of murkiness. And yet, looking into eyes like those, I couldn't read him at all. Whether a person is good or wicked, the eyes usually give something away. But his gaze was as still and unreadable as a trained assassin's, not a ripple to be found. I thought to myself that this man had probably been wearing a mask his whole life, and by now might not even know which version of himself was real. The vice director seemed to see through my skepticism and told me sincerely that he wasn't joking, but asked me not to let the prize in front of me cloud my judgment or rush me into a hasty decision. Having seen through his mask-wearing act, I actually felt more at ease. I met his gaze and turned him down directly. If I was going to step into murky water either way, there was no need to compromise and accept terms I didn't understand. I told him plainly, if he had something he needed me to do, he should just say it outright. If I felt I was capable of handling it, I'd agree. Otherwise, nothing he said would change my mind. His expression grew slightly heavier as he said that just hearing what this was about could put my life at risk, and if I chose to refuse after listening, he might have to kill me. I forced a straight face and shot back that if he had it in him, he was welcome to try, but inwardly I was quietly panicking. Had I barely been reborn only to die again so soon? Then all at once, with a soft rush of sound, he activated his magic. The air around us turned heavy in an instant. The teacups on the table rattled with the shift. His presence became something terrifying, as though he could end me in the next heartbeat. But strangely, a high-pressure situation like this didn't frighten me. My mind was already running through countermeasures at full speed. The very next second, he suddenly laughed and said he'd met his match. He told me I had passed his test. He went on to explain that what he actually needed was someone reliable, but not someone from within his own family. And just at that moment, I had appeared. Truthfully, he hadn't expected much from me at first. The white-haired boy was young, and his judgment of people couldn't be considered fully reliable. But the fact that even the matriarch, who doted on the white-haired boy so deeply, had allowed a wanderer from the gray zone to stay by his side, that alone was more than enough to suggest I was no ordinary person. I picked up the thread and asked whether he had arranged the whole argument with his younger brother, just as a pretext to get me here for a proper conversation. He gave a nod and admitted straightforwardly that he had needed a plausible reason, one that wouldn't raise suspicion from anyone watching. I kept my skeptical gaze fixed on him and waited for him to reveal his true purpose. He didn't beat around the bush, saying directly that just as I had suspected, there were certain things he found it inconvenient to handle himself. But he assured me not to overthink it. This wasn't about an internal power struggle within the family. The Brando family as a whole was united. After a brief pause, he lowered his voice deliberately and said that agents from the Declan family were watching him. I frowned and pressed him on why he was being watched. He drew a long breath and said that since I wasn't afraid of death, he'd tell me everything. He had been secretly researching the Declan family's core technique, the primordial method, and it seemed they had found out. I immediately raised a hand to stop him. Going by Declan's way of doing things, anyone who researched their core technique should have been dead long ago. There was no reason he should still be standing here unharmed. I took it a step further and reasoned that if this research was being conducted from the Brando family's perspective, the most likely goal was to find a way to counter the primordial method. A flash of recognition crossed his eyes, and he said I seemed to have a solid understanding of how Declan operated. He acknowledged my reasoning was sound, and added that if he had only been researching a countermeasure, Declan would have stopped at nothing to have him killed. But as it happened, what he ultimately discovered was a way to refine the very foundation of all Declan's secret techniques, the primordial method itself, into something even more powerful. As he said this, a note of fervent intensity crept into his voice, and he said I should be able to understand how he felt. I inwardly thought to myself, this vice director was something far beyond regular levels of unhinged. He was a full-blown lunatic with no regard for the consequences, to actually sit inside his own family's walls and secretly research something with enough power to get him killed. But that said, thinking about it this way, the timeline lined up perfectly. In my past life, the reason the Declan family had annihilated the Brando family was because of the refined version of the primordial method the vice director had developed, what came to be known as the new primordial method. The reason the Declan clan head had been willing to bet the entire survival of his family on an assault against the Brando family had finally become clear. It was apparent now that the Declan clan head had seen through the immense potential of the new primordial method right from the start, and his extraordinary power later on had its roots in precisely that technique. I was still caught up in those memories and thoughts when the vice director suddenly called my name, warning me that this was no small matter. Once I was involved, there would be no pulling back. I snapped back to the present and told him impatiently to skip the unnecessary lead-up and just say what he wanted me to do. Only then did he explain. He hadn't told anyone in the family that he was researching the primordial method. He suspected a Declan informant had infiltrated the family, but no matter how long he investigated, he couldn't identify who it was. I pointed out that since his secret research had already been discovered, he must have someone in mind as the most likely suspect. His secretary, for instance. He shook his head and ruled out the secretary, adding that the matter was actually tied to how he had obtained the primordial method's secret text in the first place. Following his reasoning, I concluded that if that was the case, he must have deliberately leaked a portion of the completed refinements to the outside world. He broke into a laugh and admitted I had it exactly right. Once he realized they had caught on, he immediately leaked part of the refined technique's formula, since he had no particular desire to die. I asked next whether simply joining the Declan family might not be the easier option. Given his research, Declan would surely welcome him with open arms. He gave an evasive reply, saying there were complications with that he wasn't able to go into. In any case, what he needed was someone with no ties to the Brando family whatsoever, someone who could quietly do things on his behalf without the family finding out. He also mentioned that the research was being carried out by a team, but the portion he was responsible for had reached a certain stage of progress. Once everything was accomplished, he would compensate me generously, and my task was simply to deliver the paper to the berserker professor at Genuine Academy. A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth as I silently calculated. This was a very good opportunity indeed. I proposed that the Healing Light Codex from before should serve as advance compensation for taking on such a dangerous assignment, and right after that I added, once the job was done, he would also need to teach me the new primordial method. Only on those terms could we truly be considered partners on the same boat, and I wanted double the promised reward. He was visibly caught off guard, then let out a somewhat resigned sigh and muttered that I had a lot of nerve. I paid his remark no mind and stated my position plainly. If he didn't agree to these terms, I wouldn't do it. He thought it over for a moment, then nodded and agreed, promising that once the new primordial method was fully refined, he would teach it to me. He also put forward an additional condition of his own. Before the research paper was completely finished, he might need my help again, and he hoped I'd be willing to lend a hand. I agreed without hesitation, saying it wasn't much to ask. As long as it was related to the paper, I'd help. I threw in a little jab and told him I didn't know how to read. Watching his stunned expression, I added with a laugh that I was only joking. Then I confirmed one more thing. Was the berserker professor actually trustworthy? He explained that during their school days, the two of them had been in constant competition for the top spot in their year. But regrettably, he had been called back to the Brando family and their rivalry had come to an end. Listening to him, I noticed privately that the way he told it, everything in his phrasing somehow subtly implied, but ultimately, I was the better one. Were all people in academic research this peculiar? As night fell, I returned to my room. To avoid drawing any attention, the vice director had packed everything he wanted to give me into a dimensional storage bag. When I opened it, I was surprised by just how much was inside. Among the many books, there was also a sealed letter tucked in between. I broke open the seal, and the very first line read, "My dearest." I couldn't help rolling my eyes and thought, dearest, what exactly? The letter explained that to ensure the smooth progress of everything going forward, the vice director had included the specific magical texts that would need to be studied, along with a detailed breakdown of the recommended order in which to study them. He expressed his hope in the letter that I would apply myself diligently so as to build up the necessary knowledge as quickly as possible. I stared at the mountain of books in front of me and inwardly thought, not a bad haul, all things considered. The collection was organized, clearly by learning stage, from foundational magical studies all the way to advanced ones. One had to admit, the vice director was genuinely brilliant, even if he was quite thoroughly unhinged. Fine by me, this was the perfect chance to build up my magical knowledge in a systematic way. I dug through the pile and pulled out a booklet labeled Index of Library Patrons. Not counting the Healing Light Codex and the new Primordial Method papers, there were still 132 books in total. I mused to myself that someday I wanted to include the Healing Light Codex in the tower I intended to build, so that everyone could read it freely. That would need more careful consideration, though. I'd find an opportunity to discuss it with the white-haired boy later. Something like that was one of the genuine perks of making friends. What the vice director had provided wasn't simply a collection of books, it was more like a complete classification system for magical knowledge. With this framework as a foundation, anyone who wanted to learn magic could construct their own system of understanding. Before, I had simply thought about stuffing the tower full of books, or giving people a place to study, but now, my perspective had shifted entirely. It gave my dream a deeper layer of meaning, and that, truly, was an unexpected blessing. On the other side of the estate, in the vice director's quarters, he stood gazing out at the night beyond the window, lost in thought. His original plan had been simple. If I was worth using, send me to deliver the paper. If not, make some use of me and discard me after. But after today's encounter, he found himself unexpectedly drawn to me, especially the moment I had said, "Kill me if you dare." He hadn't expected me to actively issue a challenge, and in that instant he had genuinely considered doing it. What stopped him was that my eyes didn't look like those of someone speaking carelessly. They looked like someone who truly had no attachment to life or death. That set me apart completely from everyone else who scrambled to survive. He had a feeling I was hiding something too, though no matter what it was, from where he stood, it was only a good thing. He had finally found a companion who could stand beside him, looking in the same direction. On top of that, I also wanted the results of his new primordial method research. This sense of mutual use held in check by mutual interest suited him perfectly. He suddenly remembered something and gave a quiet laugh, thinking there was no way I really couldn't read. The very next morning, I put on the Genuine Academy uniform, ready to set out on a new journey. And behind what seemed like a bright and promising road ahead, what unknown currents were waiting to sweep me under? I had barely finished packing when the maid knocked and stepped in. She reminded me that it was almost time to leave for the academy. As she picked up my bag, she explained that neither I nor the white-haired boy needed to sit the entrance exam. Once we arrived at the academy, we only needed to complete a simple enrollment formality. She paused and glanced over at me, a quiet look of approval in her eyes, and said softly that I was starting to look every bit the part of a proper student. The Genuine Academy uniform suited me rather well, it had to be said. I thanked her politely and followed her out. As I walked, I thought to myself, skipping the entrance exam was a good thing. No point wasting time on formalities that didn't matter. I had barely stepped out the door when I spotted the white-haired boy waving at me from a distance. Before we set off, his mother carefully reminded him to take care of himself while he was away. Then she turned to me and said this was a rare opportunity, and she hoped I would get what I was looking for. I smiled warmly and thanked her, then climbed into the carriage with the white-haired boy. As for the result I was after, I'd get it, naturally. After all, where we were headed was the finest academy on the eastern continent, and all the people who could help make my tower plan a reality were already waiting there. Before long, the carriage began rolling steadily forward. The white-haired boy and I sat facing each other inside the cabin. He fell asleep before long, so I bowed my head and flipped through the magical studies books the vice director had given me. The more I read, the more I had to admit, this man was a top-tier magical scholar. The foundational principles of magic might seem simple on the surface, but the ways of interpreting them varied enormously. Take water, for example. To some, it was a life-giving source that nourished all things. To others, it could just as easily be a catastrophic force that flooded and swallowed everything in its path. That was the difference in perspective. Even with the same foundational principle. Different families would develop their own distinctive theories based on their own positions and needs. And I noticed something sharp. The curriculum system the vice director had compiled had a subtle hidden connection to the Declan family's primordial method, making it particularly well-suited to my own training. I wasn't sure how much time had passed when the white-haired boy finally woke. He exclaimed excitedly and told me to look out the window. I followed his gaze and had to admit, Genuine Academy lived up to its reputation in every way. Just then the carriage came to a stop, and the maid opened the door to explain that this was as far as she could take us. It was the teaching of the first headmaster. Regardless of status or background, every student had to walk through the academy gates on their own 2 feet. She bid us farewell here and wished us all the best. After she left, the white-haired boy grabbed my arm and started rushing me along urgently. He said she had told him that being late to the enrollment ceremony might mean losing a seat. That was almost certainly a story she'd made up on the spot to keep him from dawdling on the way. Well, even if she came across as stern and cold, she was probably a good person at heart. And of course, I was absolutely not going along with it just because it was more convenient. The moment we stepped into the classroom, quite a few people had already taken their seats. Students were chattering noisily all around. The white-haired boy couldn't help blurting out that the maid had been telling the truth after all. He was completely unrecognizable from the version of himself who had refused point-blank to come to the academy. Seeing how drastically he'd changed, I pressed a hand to my forehead in exasperation. Then I reached into my pocket. After a bit of rummaging, I pulled out our enrollment certificates and began looking for our assigned seats. Just as I was about to steer the white-haired boy toward our spots, someone suddenly shoved him hard to the ground. He looked up in a daze. A large, stocky figure was glaring down at him with undisguised hostility, and in a rough voice demanded to know if he was looking for trouble on purpose. I stepped forward quickly to help the white-haired boy up and quietly asked if he was all right. He said he was fine and scrambled to his feet, immediately bowing his head to apologize to the big guy. But the big guy wasn't having any of it and called us to stop. He pointed at his clothes and barked at the white-haired boy, furious about a stain left on his sleeve. I looked more closely and inwardly winced. It was drool from the white-haired boy. Before I could say a word, the white-haired boy had already leaned forward and incredibly tried to wipe it off with his own saliva. My heart dropped. That was definitely going to set something off. Sure enough, the big guy shoved the white-haired boy away and swung a fist straight at him. Thankfully, my reflexes were fast enough to dart forward, and I caught his punch cleanly. I said in a low voice that this wasn't the right way to handle things, and suggested we leave it at that. The big guy fixed me with a hard stare and demanded to know who I thought I was. I told him calmly that I was the white-haired boy's friend. The big guy raised an eyebrow and said I wasn't a bad friend. After all, very few people were willing to take a hit for someone else, so in that case, I could be the one to make it up to him. I sighed inwardly. Was I really going to get off on the wrong foot with a classmate on the very first day? But then again, there was no way I could just stand there and watch the white-haired boy get pushed around. By now, a sizable crowd of students had gathered nearby, whispering amongst themselves. Someone murmured that by the looks of it, a fight was probably about to break out. Someone else said they didn't recognize me or the white-haired boy, but they knew the big guy was a young lord of the Durampe family. They added that the Durampe family's young members entering this year were all strong, and the odds were heavily in the big guy's favor. Someone had even started directing the crowd, telling everyone to step back and clear some space to avoid getting caught in the blast, assigning 2 people to manage the betting, getting the students who knew magic to cast a protective barrier around the perimeter. The scene heated up quickly, with plenty of people shouting encouragement at the big guy and putting their money on him to win. Someone bet 2 meal tickets, someone else jumped in with 3. The whole thing was spiraling into chaos. From deep in the crowd, a voice called out that everyone was a bunch of idiots, because betting on the underdog to win was where the real wisdom was. The big guy locked his eyes on me and proudly declared his title, the Fist King. He announced that he was the second young master of the Durampe family, a name they wore with pride. Then asked what my name was. I replied plainly that I was just a commoner. He could think of me as nobody in particular. The big guy didn't pay my brush off much mind and gestured for me to strike first. I let out a scornful laugh, thinking he was genuinely ridiculous, going on about not liking to waste words, while being the one doing all the talking. I deliberately baited him and asked if he was scared. Predictably, the big guy was provoked in an instant. With a furious roar, he raised his massive fist and brought it crashing toward me. I shifted my body to one side with fluid ease and stepped out of the path of his heavy, forceful strike without any effort. The big guy's punch hit nothing but air, and the missed swing threw off his balance, sending him stumbling half a step forward. I grinned and tilted my chin at him, reminding him that there were 2 of us. I tightened my fist and charged forward in a burst, and drove a punch square into his face, sending him flying on the spot. The big guy staggered and barely managed to keep himself upright. He loudly declared that a punch from some magic track student was nothing. He could take a few of those without flinching, but the force behind my blow when it landed was far beyond what he had anticipated. He stared at me in stunned disbelief, looking me up and down with wide eyes. The next second he felt a warm sensation, and looking up, he found the white-haired boy casting healing magic on him. He looked completely baffled and couldn't fathom why anyone would do that. He bluntly snapped at the white-haired boy and asked if he was an idiot. I fired back that he was the idiot and mocked him. Truly a credit to his noble family, managing to get distracted even while taking a beating. I raised my hand and kept swinging, landing punch after punch on him, telling him as I went that it wouldn't be long before he understood what fear actually felt like. Throughout the fight, I stayed on the offensive as always, while the white-haired boy kept casting healing magic on our opponent. Our roles roles were clearly defined and we worked together with remarkable fluency. Under the relentless pressure of my assault, the big guy was quickly driven into a steady retreat, and he had well and truly experienced the dread of being beaten over and over with no end in sight. Students in the crowd were growing anxious at the sight, shouting at the big guy to stop holding back. They kept cheering him on at the top of their lungs, calling him the rising star of the Durampe family, the star of the Eastern continent, the pride and hope of all who walk the fighter's path. Every one of them was absolutely certain he would pull through and claim victory in the end. Spurred on by the crowd's roars, the big guy gritted his teeth and his eyes turned more ferocious than ever. He muttered under his breath that some magic track nobody actually dared to act this recklessly in front of him. Barely had the words left his mouth before he launched a storm of relentless, thunderous attacks. I was already ready for it. I shifted my body nimbly to the side and slipped out of his assault once again with ease. I silently acknowledged it. The big guy actually had some real ability. He'd just picked the wrong opponent. Before I had even steadied myself, the big guy channeled every ounce of strength in his body and hurled a heavy loaded punch. It came tearing through the air with a whistling howl, driving straight at me. I didn't dodge. I let that punch land on purpose. The crowd watching erupted in shouts, marveling at the sheer power behind the blow. But the moment that fist connected, the big guy's mind was flooded with confusion. The sensation was all wrong, strangely light, like punching into cotton, with no force to push back against at all. In the moment he stood there disoriented, I executed several quick, nimble rolls in succession, landed cleanly and steadied myself. I casually brushed the dust off my clothes and said flatly that he wasn't all that impressive after all. Seeing me standing there completely unharmed, the big guy couldn't hide his shock. Then his eyes went bloodshot and fury overtook him. He abandoned all restraint and came charging at me with everything he had. I glanced sideways at the white-haired boy. He was still in high spirits, enthusiastically piling recovery magic onto the big guy one cast after another. The two of us working in this rhythm, one attacking, one healing, was certainly a satisfying way to wear someone down. But this was a school, and dragging it out any further wasn't ideal. I needed to knock him out cold in one clean hit and be done with it. I ran the calculations in my head. This technique should be more than enough. It was something I had developed together with my comrades in my past life through years of research and refinement. At its core, it extracted energy from the collision of magical particles. It involved magical energy, but it fell under neither combat fighting nor conventional magic. It was more of a specialized technique derived purely from the inherent properties of magical energy itself. I silently invoked the name in my mind, the collision style, and launched the attack straight at the big guy. The moment the strike detonated, even the students maintaining the protective barrier around the perimeter lost their footing. Someone cried out in shock, completely thrown by how much force had just been unleashed. Every eye in the room snapped back to the big guy. His legs buckled, and he dropped straight to his knees. The next second, he toppled over backward and went completely still, out cold. For one brief moment, the entire room went dead silent. Every single person watching was stunned speechless by what had just happened. I raised my hand and turned toward the crowd with an expressionless face, giving them a signal that they could go ahead and cheer now. The next second, the crowd erupted, with people buzzing excitedly about how incredible the fight had been. The person who had bet on me earlier pumped their fist in triumph, shouting that they'd won, and fired back at everyone else that they had told them. The underdog bet always pays. I called out to them, walked over and ruffled their hair with a grin, saying we won, and made sure to remind them while I was at it. No more sucking on their fingers. It really was terribly unhygienic. It was at that moment the entire room finally burst into wild, thunderous applause. One young student remarked in amazement that I was something else, clearly a magic track student, yet with close combat ability that far surpassed anyone from the combat track. They also marveled that the two of us worked together in a way that was truly rare, a perfect pairing for wearing someone down without mercy. Just as everyone was still buzzing from the shock of the fight, a stern voice cut through the noise, demanding to know who had dared to get into a brawl on the very first day of enrollment. I looked up, a teacher had arrived, and I knew immediately we were in trouble. Not that it mattered. I was a crisis management specialist by trade, and a minor situation like this was nothing I couldn't handle. I was just about to slip away with the white-haired boy when he shot his hand up and cheerfully announced to the teacher that we were the ones who did it. I could have closed my eyes and pretended I'd never met this person in my life. The teacher parted through the crowd and walked over, glanced briefly at the big guy unconscious on the ground, then told us to come with him. And just like that, the two of us were escorted directly to the teacher's office. The teacher said that given we had come forward on our own, he would forego any punishment this time. Besides, the student who had been on the receiving end didn't appear to be seriously hurt, but he warned us to keep ourselves in line and said he would be keeping a close eye on us going forward. I nodded quickly and put on my most obedient and cooperative expression. After leaving the office, we headed straight for the building where the enrollment ceremony was being held. We pushed open the door. Thankfully, the ceremony hadn't officially begun yet. When people noticed us walk in, quite a few began whispering, marveling that someone who looked as lean as me had actually beaten a fist fighter. Others remarked that I and the white-haired boy were a pair of lunatics, and they would be giving us a wide berth from now on. The white-haired boy paid none of that any mind and waved happily, telling me we were famous now. I gave him a helpless pat on the shoulder and reminded him that going forward, he needed to keep a low profile inside the academy. But the white-haired white-haired boy looked up with his most innocent expression and said it was so nice of everyone to save seats just for us. Not long after, the enrollment ceremony officially got underway. The headmaster stepped up to the podium and launched into a lengthy address. I glanced to my side. The white-haired boy had somehow already dozed off in his chair, drool and all. The absolute lack of guard he had around him was something else, pure and simple as a person could be. Still, watching him sleep like that, I couldn't hold back a smile. I reached over, lifted his arm, and used his own sleeve to wipe away the drool, muttering under my breath that I had told him 1,000 times to stop drooling. It was so embarrassing. Just then, a staff member walked briskly up to the headmaster and murmured into his ear that something urgent had come up and required his personal attention. I was puzzled. What could possibly be more pressing than the enrollment ceremony right now? The headmaster listened, then gave a solemn nod. He turned to face the students in the hall and told them something had come up that required him to leave early. The remainder of the ceremony would proceed as planned, and they needn't worry. With that, the headmaster stepped off and hurried out. A woman with long brown hair then walked up onto the stage. She called for everyone's attention. The sudden spike in her voice startled the entire room. The white-haired boy jolted awake on the spot. Even some of the teachers hadn't quite braced for it, and several of them flinched. This woman, known as the Ponytail Battle Maiden, then announced that she would be standing in for the headmaster to host the rest of the enrollment ceremony. After a brief pause, she continued, announcing that the next segment was the new student pledge and inviting the representative from the magic track to the stage first. A wave of hushed murmuring broke out in the audience below, with some wondering aloud why someone from the Dainai family had even bothered to sit the entrance exam. Someone in the crowd immediately shot back that she was the third daughter of the Dainai family head. If she truly lacked ability, the family head would never have let her sit for it in the first place. I quietly noted to myself who was about to step forward, my old rival as fate would have it. If Declan was the foremost magical family on the eastern continent, then the Dainai family held a firm second place just behind it, and this particular rival of mine was the central mage within the Dainai family, the one they had long pinned their hopes on, cultivated to one day represent the family in battle. Her abilities were genuinely remarkable, and in my past life, when I had decided to leave my position as a crisis management specialist, she had helped me considerably. But the relationship between us was less that of mutual benefactors, and more accurately described as that of sworn rivals. Of all things, in this life, my old rival had ended up as a fellow new student entering in the same year as me. Right after that, the Ponytail Battle Maiden announced the next representative, the student from the combat track, and called them to the stage. The moment she finished speaking, a young man with a scar across his face stood and made his way up. From his clothes and the air about him, it was clear he came from no noble background whatsoever. I thought to myself that the noble-born students in the room must be eating themselves alive with jealousy at the sight of a commoner standing up as the combat track's representative. Once the new student pledge segment wrapped up smoothly, the Ponytail Battle Maiden continued hosting the proceedings and announced that she would now introduce the professors responsible for guiding the incoming students. As my rival stepped down from the stage, her gaze deliberately swept toward the area where I was sitting. I wasn't sure whether it was just my imagination, but it felt like her eyes had lingered on me for the briefest moment, as though she had actually caught my gaze. But then she simply stumbled slightly on the step. I shook my head. That wasn't what mattered right now. The vice director had asked me to find the berserker professor. I had no idea when his turn to take the stage would come. It wasn't long before a booming voice filled the hall. I followed the sound. The one speaking was the berserker professor himself. I had expected him to give off a similar impression to the vice director, but he turned out to be completely different. Then again, the vice director was someone who excelled at concealing himself. I couldn't rush to any conclusions about the berserker professor either. Once all the professors had finished introducing themselves, the Ponytail Battle Maiden declared the enrollment ceremony closed and told everyone to head to the dormitories to get settled. I turned to look at the white-haired boy beside me. He had somehow dozed off again without me noticing. I reached over with a resigned sigh and gave his shoulder a pat, trying to wake him. The white-haired boy stirred and blinked groggily back to consciousness. I messed with him and said he'd been caught napping, earned himself an expulsion, and was being sent home. The white-haired boy immediately burst into a wail at that. I got his mood back on track and led him toward the student dormitory block. After collecting our room numbers from the administrator, we split up and went our separate ways. The accommodations had been quietly divided into zones for nobles and commoners behind the scenes, so the two of us weren't in the same dormitory. I climbed all the way to the top floor and found my assigned room by the number. I gently pushed the door open, and inwardly noted that the dormitory accommodations were really quite decent. A complete set of daily necessities had already been placed in the room ahead of time. Every new student had received the exact same set of items. A thoughtful touch. Just then, the door was pushed open from outside. It was the scarred young man who had gone up as the combat track student representative, so he was my roommate. He said in a flat tone that he hoped we could coexist peacefully. He had no intention of interfering with anything I did, and hoped I'd extend him the same courtesy. I suppressed a quiet laugh. This kid had some personality to him. I recalled that he had ranked first among the incoming combat track students. What I couldn't tell yet was whether his actual ability lived up to that ranking. The thought barely flickered through my mind before I reached out toward him in a probing gesture. The scarred young man startled instantly, his body tensing on pure instinct as his guard shot up. I noted to myself with quiet approval that his reaction time was sharp and his physical control looked solid. He even adjusted his sword grip deliberately to avoid catching anything nearby as he drew. He had genuine skill. Right at the height of that tense standoff, the white-haired boy's voice drifted in from just outside the dormitory door. I used the timing to pull my hand back and made up a casual excuse on the spot, saying I was just on my way out. I gave the scarred young man a pat on the shoulder, said with a grin that whatever he wanted to do was fine, just don't interfere with me either. I stepped out of the dormitory building to find the white-haired boy bounding over toward me full of energy. He grabbed my arm and said enthusiastically that he wanted to explore the whole academy. He also brought up that the maid had told him there were lots of interesting places on campus. She had specifically told him to go and look around on the very first day, and that he absolutely had to bring me along. I understood immediately. Genoan Academy was enormous, and the maid had obviously told him that to make sure he didn't get lost by getting me to walk him through the grounds. Going for a wander wasn't a bad idea. There was actually something that had been on my mind. Even though my perception in this life wasn't as sharp as it had been in my past one, I had still faintly picked up on something off about the energy in the air. It carried the signature of someone from the Declan family, and judging by the quality of it, this person was a crisis management specialist. I wanted to see for myself just how many of them had slipped inside. I smiled and nodded, saying, "Let's go take a look around then." After that, we wandered through the academy, making our way around its grounds. Along the way, the white-haired boy talked animatedly about everything he saw, and the mood between us was easy and relaxed. We'd been walking for hours and I was already worn out, and the white-haired boy was still bouncing around with boundless energy. I sighed internally. I was exhausted. This genuinely felt like looking after a child. With me here keeping an eye on him, the Brando family could certainly rest easier, but I had always been someone who repaid every slight. So I casually told the white-haired boy that since he liked the lake so much, he could just have his family dig one for him, fill it with water, and he'd have his very own lake. The white-haired boy's eyes lit up immediately and said it was a brilliant idea, declaring on the spot that he'd have the maid dig him one even bigger and deeper than the one in front of them. Back at the Brando estate, the maid sneezed for no apparent reason. The white-haired boy stared at the water for a moment, then started wondering what he should name his future lake. As I offered a name suggestion, I managed to sneak in another dig at the maid. The maid, seemingly sensing something, shivered without knowing why. And then the white-haired boy pointed at a statue not far away and exclaimed that the bronze figure looked wonderfully detailed. I followed his lead and suggested his family have a statue made for him too, shaped like a dragon. The maid at the estate found herself inexplicably unsettled, with no idea why a sudden chill had just run through her. Evening came, and I proposed heading back for dinner. While we had been walking around the academy earlier, I'd spotted 7 crisis management specialists. Their movements were concentrated mainly around the second magic hall, the building that housed the Berserker Professor's research room. I hadn't been entirely sure of their target before, but seeing this now confirmed it. They were after the Berserker Professor. Declan had likely sensed that someone was quietly helping the Vice Director, and had begun to suspect the Berserker Professor who had a known connection to him. I was just wondering why they hadn't been tailing me when I turned around and noticed someone already had. In that case, let me find out exactly what they know. When night fell, a crisis management specialist moved swiftly through the darkness, leaping nimbly between rooftops and walls, moving quickly and without a trace, then dropped into an empty room. The first greeted their arriving comrade and asked where the others had gone. The second said the others had headed back already. Command had just issued an urgent order for everyone to immediately converge on the target's den. The first asked whether the target was the primary or the secondary. The second answered it was the secondary and added that the primary had already detected them. The first said they had obtained valuable intelligence. Tonight at midnight, the objective would be delivered to the secondary target. After a moment's thought, they concluded that it seemed the primary target, the Vice Director, had officially made his move. Now that Command had issued a dedicated order, it meant that among all the secondary targets, the one they'd been assigned to watch, the Berserker Professor, was in fact the true core secondary target. The second looked troubled at that, questioning whether just the few of them could actually break through the defenses of a professor whose strength was on the level of a monster. In their view, at the very least they needed the number 1 agent, or a couple of the odd-numbered members, to have any real shot at this. The first replied that number 1 wasn't coming, and none of the other odd-numbered members would be deployed either. That got a curse out of the second under their breath. The first then added that the Fire Demon would be joining them. The second's expression turned even graver at that. The Fire Demon was someone who would do absolutely anything to complete a mission. The unspoken implication was that this was no different from being told to go die for the assignment. In the end, neither of them had any other option. They could only reassure each other, and set out at once. They both knew that their only hope of surviving lay in staying together. Once those 2 crisis management specialists had moved on, I slowly drew my head out from where I had been hiding. So they were planning to make their move tonight at midnight. What concerned me even more was that they had brought in the Fire Demon. Thinking back to my days as an active crisis management specialist, the Fire Demon had been at the absolute peak of his strength. After the Declan family staked everything on that all-out war against the Brando family, the Fire Demon had proven his unwavering loyalty to Declan in the most concrete terms possible. Even now, he was dangerous enough. But his true peak had come after the war with the Brando family, so I had to take him down now, before he reached that pinnacle. And the Fire Demon's magic was rooted in the Declan Fire Attribute secret texts. That alone made the risk worth taking. I had been wondering earlier why that one crisis management specialist had turned back after leaving. Now it made perfect sense, and this was quite a stroke of luck. But there was still something, puzzling me. The objective they had mentioned, the vice director's paper. It was right here in my hands, yet they were saying it would be delivered to the secondary target tonight. The paper I had couldn't be a fake, and the objective they were referring to had to be this paper, which meant what was being delivered to the berserker professor at midnight tonight was necessarily a decoy. At the same time, back in the dormitory, my roommate, the scarred young man, quietly sat up, changed into clothes suited for movement, moving with careful deliberateness, ran through a thorough check of everything he was carrying, then with equal care picked up what was supposedly the objective. He glanced over at the me asleep in the bed, confirmed that nothing had been noticed, and slipped out of the room without a sound, making his way toward the second magic hall. At that moment, the berserker professor was seated at the desk in his research room. He had long since become aware of the Declan family's informants lurking around like rats. They hadn't dared to cross the line before, so he had held himself back and let it go for the time being. But now they had finally had the nerve to violate his territory directly. As he sat and quietly waited for those rats to show themselves, the research room door was pushed open softly. A familiar figure stepped inside. It was the scarred young man. The berserker professor understood immediately. Someone had sent a mercenary to carry out the job. The professor called out his infiltration in a measured tone, telling him that next time he wanted to try sneaking in like this, he'd need to learn to alter the nature of his ether first. The scarred young man's stomach dropped. He said nothing and simply stepped forward quickly to hand over an envelope. The berserker professor reached out and accepted it, but didn't open it right away. He turned it over in his mind. This student in front of him was just a neutral mercenary, carrying out a task and knowing nothing beyond that. And Rose slipped past Declan's watchful eyes. The vice director had been trying all along to find a way to get the paper to him safely. Why would he use a method this careless? While the berserker professor was still thinking it through, the door was pushed open again by another arrival. A thunderous explosion erupted in the same instant. The fire demon spoke with swaggering arrogance, greeting the berserker professor, and remarked that a bookworm like the professor who never left his research room probably had no idea who he was. He swept his gaze around the room and broke into a grin when he spotted the scarred young man, saying there was already another guest. He also noted the look on the scarred young man's face. He seemed to have recognized him. The professor looked up at him briefly with detached disinterest and told him to cut the idle talk and get to the point, and added that the stench of rats coming off the fire demon was about to ruin his nose. The fire demon paused for a moment, then broke into laughter, a laughter filled with savagery, his eyes going vicious in the same instant. He pointed at the scarred young man and said the Brando lackey who'd brought the document obviously had to die. As for the professor, they'd leave him one eye and one arm, that would be enough. The words were barely out before the fire demon made the first move, unleashing a skill wreathed in scorching flame that surged straight for the professor. The professor immediately activated his magic to intercept it. Sparks flew as metal and magical force met head-on. A deafening explosion tore through the research room as the two of them clashed in an instant. The scarred young man was thrown back again and again by the wild shockwaves of energy, completely unable to close the distance to the fight. All he could do was clench his fists and watch the battle with tight-wound anxiety from the sideline. In the thick of the battle, the berserker professor fought back, while saying in a low, even tone to the scarred young man beside him. He told him that from this moment on, he was no longer his student. As a mercenary, what came next was his own responsibility to survive. In the midst of the brawl, the berserker professor's mind was working quietly. The academy's alarm system had in all likelihood been neutralized ahead of time by Declan's rats using a concealment spell. Was his only option now to put his hopes in that mercenary kid? But thinking back to the look of helpless panic on his face just moments ago, that didn't exactly inspire confidence. In the end, he'd have to rely on himself. Meanwhile, the fire demon's assault was growing more ferocious by the second, each strike carrying the force to raise everything in its path. As he attacked relentlessly, he screamed at the professor to hand over the document, threatening to obliterate him body and soul if he didn't comply. As the words left his mouth, the fire demon condensed a massive fireball in his palm and hurled it forward. The berserker professor rapidly channeled the magic around him into a shield. The shield and the fireball collided. The violent explosion flipped the experimental tables nearby off their feet. Savage energy tore in every direction, blasting cracks across the walls. The scarred young man was still being pushed back by the shockwaves and couldn't get anywhere near the fight. The berserker professor could only press on alone, searching desperately for an opening through the relentless barrage. The fire demon saw this and reacted fast, immediately sealing off every possible angle of counterattack. From my position at a distance, I felt the sharp pulse of magical energy detonating clearly, and knew they had already started fighting. I reached into the dimensional storage bag and pulled out the mask I had prepared in advance and put it on. Right now, I wasn't a student at the academy, I was crisis management specialist number 1. That feeling of wearing this identity again, it had been a long time. Before setting out of old habit, I looked up at the night sky and made a quiet wish to the moon that I would complete today's mission without a hitch. The wish made, I let a slow, deliberate smile curl at the corner of my mouth. My figure flashed, and I became a streak of swift shadow racing toward the battlefield. Tonight, I hadn't come to resolve a crisis. Tonight, I had come to be the crisis itself. Out of the corner of his eye, the fire demon caught sight of the scarred young man still standing. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. The scarred young man was gasping heavily, his his back already drenched in cold sweat. He knew it wasn't luck. He quietly thanked the talisman his captain had slipped him beforehand. Without it to absorb the blow, that last strike would have finished him. At that moment, the berserker professor sensed the fire demon's intent and quickly shoved the scarred young man to the side, then moved with clean precision and broke through the fire demon's attack. Afterward, the berserker professor came to stand before the scarred young man, and something closer to trust had entered his eyes. He tossed him a sword forged with aether, and in a low voice asked whether he could hold against what was coming next. The scarred young man gritted his teeth, gripped the enchanted sword, and forced himself to say he could, while inwardly laughing bitterly. It wasn't really a question of whether he could hold on. Failing to hold on simply meant death. The fire demon watched this exchange from the side and broke into applause. He remarked with amusement that one mage focused on offense and one guardian focused on defense made for quite a combination. The words had barely left his mouth before the magical energy around the fire demon erupted without warning, and he unleashed a devastating strike. The scarred young man immediately swung the enchanted sword and braced himself against the ferocious attack. The berserker professor stepped to the side in an instant, gathering the magical energy around him, ready to seize an opening and counter. The professor reflected to himself. The scarred young man's defense was holding the assault at bay for now, but continuing to play defense like this would only leave them being led around by the nose. In that case, he had no choice but to go all in. The amount of magical energy naturally present in the environment was inherently limited. When two individuals competed for control of that energy simultaneously, a direct contest of control between them would formally begin. With that in mind, the berserker professor fixed his gaze on the fire demon and asked in an ice-cold tone whether he dared to pit his control of magical energy against his. The fire demon raised an eyebrow and broke into a laugh, eyes full of contempt, and accepted the challenge on the spot. Before the words had even finished, both of them simultaneously drove the magical energy around them outward, igniting a fierce contest of magical force. The terrifying surge of magical energy swept through the room like a tidal wave. Fortunately, the scarred young man reacted quickly, shielded his vital points, and threw himself out of the blast zone in time. Even so, the residual energy still slammed into him with crushing force and launched him into the air. He landed in the rubble and thought to himself, the level these two were fighting at was something else entirely. They were flat-out monsters. The crisis management specialists, watching from a distance, took one look at the scene and swallowed hard. The one leading them said that getting any closer would be throwing their lives away, and ordered everyone to hold position. From where I was hidden, I did a quick head count. I seized the gap and slipped in without a sound and launched my ambush. In a single flash of movement, I had crossed past all of them. The crisis management specialist startled all at once and cried out sharply. By then, I had already landed squarely in the center of the battlefield. The two locked in their magical contest were both snapped out of it by the sudden commotion and turned to look at me at the same time. I grinned and announced at the top of my voice that I had arrived. The fire demon was the first to lose his composure. He roared immediately, demanding to know what I thought I was playing at. I didn't waste words on him and went straight at him, swinging my blade down, while declaring in a cold voice that this was where he would meet his end. The fire demon felt the terrifying pressure radiating from the blade in that instant and trembled all over. He instinctively drove the magical energy around his body outward. Blade and magical force collided violently, triggering an explosive detonation. The fire demon used the force of the blast to send himself flying several meters back. He landed in a mess, staggered, and barely managed to stay upright. But the moment he steadied himself, the magical energy inside him reversed flow, sending blood and energy surging the wrong way. Naturally, I wasn't about to give him any time to recover, and I charged in again. The fire demon's mind raced. He knew he needed to suppress the internal magical reversal first. At the same time, the other crisis management specialist had come rushing onto the scene. The fire demon seized the moment, quickly pulled out a vial and tipped it back, recovering his breath as he did, while wondering with genuine bafflement where exactly this person had come from. I had no time to answer his question. I was focused on handling the crisis management specialists closing in from all sides. The fire demon watched my movements, and something like alarm stirred in his chest. This was extraordinary. Every move I made was sharp, efficient, and without waste. The magic I chose was always the most appropriate and the fastest option available. The fire demon caught himself abruptly and cursed internally for getting caught up admiring an enemy's skill in the middle of a fight. He bared his teeth and snarled that no matter who I was, anyone who stood in his way would die. With that, he stopped suppressing his magical energy and instead channeled every last bit of his strength. He launched his ultimate technique without holding anything back, intent on wiping out everyone present in one sweep. I stood perfectly still watching him, without any sign of moving to dodge. Another violent explosion erupted, and smoke billowed out to fill the entire space. The fire demon gave a cold laugh from within the smoke, assuming I must have been finished off. He glanced indifferently at the crisis management specialist sprawled on the ground, thinking to himself that getting caught up in his attack was their own problem and nothing to do with him. What mattered most was completing the mission. He caught his breath and muttered to himself that getting this worked up really wasn't like him at all. I looked at the sorry state he was in and asked whether he really thought that was all the strength he had to show. Under his stunned gaze, I walked out of the drifting smoke without a scratch. I told him that on the surface he looked like a man who had cut himself free from all restraint, but underneath he was as cold as a snake. I had seen through his intent to strike at the core of my power long before he acted, and the reason he had failed was precisely because he was too cold, too detached. Then my magic bullet shot shot toward him with pinpoint precision. The fire demon's pupils contracted sharply and his body didn't even have time to react with a dodge. There was a sharp crack, and the magic bullet landed squarely between his eyes. He immediately toppled over backward and went completely still. I drew back my magical energy and landed steadily. Any other mage would have died from my ambush earlier, yet he had actually managed to fight back. Worthy of the name of a renowned battle mage, his reaction speed and judgment were both exceptional. If he had coordinated with those crisis management specialists just now, I might have lost. After all, my current magical reserves were far below his, but in the end, he was too arrogant. I walked over and quickly searched the fire demon's person. It didn't take long to find the dimensional storage bag he was carrying. The bag had a user recognition spell locked onto it, so I'd have to crack it gradually over time. For now, there were more pressing things that needed my attention. I turned and looked at the figure behind me and said they were a little late. The professor walked over and explained in an even tone that he had gone to freeze the remaining rats lurking around the perimeter, which was what had taken him so long. He then studied me with a measuring look and asked whether I was a Declan rat as well. I clicked my tongue quietly and inwardly called them both lunatics. The berserker professor raised an eyebrow and said that by the look of it, I was someone sent by the vice director. He added for good measure that he was not a lunatic. The professor changed direction and asked whether the vice director had split that paper into two, and what the situation was with the mercenary who had approached him earlier. I said honestly that I hadn't heard the vice director mention any of that. I went on to reason through it. This was probably the vice director's plan. He had likely used the fake paper to draw out Declan's people. It would raise the Brando family and the Academy's guard while also weakening Declan's presence and influence on the side. The professor fixed his eyes on me for a few seconds, then asked directly. I was the one actually delivering the real paper, wasn't I? I didn't deny it, and reached into the dimensional storage bag to pull out the real paper and hand it to him. He took it, flipped it open, and scanned the contents quickly, then looked up and asked whether I had already read it. I replied lightly, read it? Far more than that. I looked at him and added that if he wanted to do something about it, I wouldn't refuse. But I reminded him, was he sure he wanted to lose a reliable ally? The professor was silent for a moment, then said he had no interest in losing one either. He paused, then asked what I wanted. He explained that the vice director only trusted people whose desires were clear and pointed in the same direction as his own. So to build trust, he needed to offer me something in return. I said I wanted books. I wanted to build a tall, grand tower and fill it with books that anyone could come and read. And I hoped to include books documenting the professor's own views on magical studies. The professor let out a quiet laugh and said it would be simpler to just write a book and give it to me directly. I nodded and said we had a deal, then turned to leave. The professor called me back right away and asked how to reach me going forward. I said with a light quip that I had no interest in taking contact details from a man, then pulled a string of crystal orbs from the dimensional storage bag and tossed them to him. When he needed to reach me, he could crush one. If something urgent came up, he could crush two or more. The berserker professor said he felt a bit put out. He wasn't exactly eager to have a man's contact details either, but I had already leapt into the air and vanished into the night. Not long after, the Imperial Royal Knight Brigade arrived at the scene in a hurry. They swiftly cleared away all evidence of the battle to guard against another attack. They also made emergency arrangements to evacuate the students to safety. I took the chance to slip into the student crowd unnoticed. The white-haired boy spotted me and ran over asking where I'd been. I made up an excuse on the spot, said I'd gone to use the bathroom. The white-haired boy looked genuinely concerned and asked if I was constipated and offered to treat it for me. I thanked him but declined, and thought to myself that with clear evidence of what had happened, the Declan family should keep a low profile for a while. But in the moment I had blocked the fire demon's magic, the power of the mark had suddenly seeped into my force field, though thanks to that surge of power, I had been able to successfully counter and fight back, so it was, all things considered, a good thing. Still, this kind of technique was commonly used by element-type mages, allowing the caster to remain unaffected by magical impact. Why had it suddenly activated now, and what were the conditions that triggered it? It seemed I'd need to look into this properly. Just then, an unfamiliar classmate walked over to greet me. He said my combat ability seemed impressive and he wanted to make friends. My heart jumped a little. I thought for a moment he might have noticed something, but then he brought up what had happened during the enrollment ceremony. Hearing that, I let out a quiet breath of relief. The white-haired boy noticed and looked a little put out. He tugged at my arm and tried to pull me away, but the freckled boy followed along, a bit sheepishly asking if we'd consider letting him join us. I understood the situation easily enough, even though the Academy promoted equal treatment regardless of background. That was the Academy's position, not how the students or their families saw things. Those from poorer backgrounds would naturally get pushed aside by students from wealthy families, and the freckled boy was probably in exactly that situation. The white-haired boy heard this and felt sorry for him, and immediately welcomed the freckled boy into our group on the spot. I shrugged. Either way was fine with me. I couldn't help but reflect on it. This life had thrown so many unhinged people my way, I had almost forgotten what an ordinary peaceful day felt like. And with that, life at the Academy had officially begun. The next morning, I woke the white-haired boy up, then brought him to class. He was still in the middle of a yawn, saying drowsily that he was so sleepy. The freckled boy came over to greet us around then, and immediately complained that there had been an actual battle last night and they still had to come to class today like nothing happened. Completely unreasonable. I looked the freckled boy over. From what I'd seen of him the previous night, he was lively, funny, and a decent person overall. He then mentioned that on his way to class, he'd heard that the homeroom teacher for our class M3 was the ponytail battle maiden, then said with enthusiasm that she was the one who had single-handedly wiped out an entire cavern of giants. Just as he finished saying that, the ponytail battle maiden walked into the classroom. I remembered now, she was the professor who had stepped in for the headmaster during the enrollment ceremony. The ponytail battle maiden walked to the front of the class and greeted everyone. She said that before the first lesson began, she would be conducting a magical energy measurement, primarily assessing the quantity and quality of each student's magical energy. And she asked which of the two we thought was more important. A cute girl in the class immediately raised her hand. She stood and said there was no absolute right answer. But if a mage's magical energy was above average in quantity, then quality became the more important factor. She gave an example. In a contest between two mages of equal rank, the one with higher quality magical energy would have the advantage. I agreed with her reasoning internally. Magical energy quality genuinely did affect a spell's accuracy, stability, and power. After all, no matter how much magical energy you had, it was useless if you couldn't land a hit. The ponytail battle maiden responded with a click of her tongue. The cute girl startled and looked at the professor anxiously. The ponytail battle maiden then asked which family she was from. The cute girl said her family's name quietly. The professor remarked flatly that it figured, and the cute girl slumped onto her desk looking completely dejected. The professor asked whether anyone else wanted to answer, and the classroom went silent. She swept her gaze across the room and said that if no one raised their hand, she would simply call on someone at random. The student she pointed to said they thought the quantity of magical energy was more important, adding that in large-scale battles the impact of raw volume should be greater. I thought to myself that was fair. Ultimately, it came down to the actual situation, and both quantity and quality mattered. But the ponytail battle maiden clicked her tongue again. I was starting to wonder what was going on. She continued calling on students one by one. The next one hesitated and said they thought speed was more important. She immediately asked about their family background. She called on another student who had barely said they thought mindset was more important before she cut in to ask about their family. I couldn't hold back an internal eye roll. She was completely ignoring what the students were actually saying. Was she really intent on killing the mood in class like this? And what was the right answer supposed to be anyway? At that point, the ponytail battle maiden spoke up and said the question had no correct answer to begin with, so what she wanted to hear wasn't a correct answer. She told everyone to think carefully about whether what they had said was their actual honest thought, or whether they had been trying to guess at the answer she wanted. She emphasized that a mage must never lose their own perspective, and must make it an absolute rule to remain unswayed by others and see their own thinking through completely. Then she asked the class, was what they had just done really the mindset a mage ought to have? The room fell silent at those words. The ponytail battle maiden went on to say that this was the lesson she had wanted to get across today, and she hoped everyone would remember it. After hearing all of that, everyone in the room sat there a little stunned. I thought to myself, so I was right all along. She'd been going in circles, being deliberately unhinged the whole time. The ponytail battle maiden cleared her throat and told everyone to come up in order to have their magical energy measured. But before getting started, she said she had found the cute girl's answer memorable, so she was appointing her as the class representative for M3's magic track going forward, and asked her to come up and record everyone's magical energy readings. The cute girl's face lit up in an instant, and she thanked the professor eagerly for her recognition. The freckled boy muttered beside me about how envious he was, and I genuinely couldn't figure out what there was to envy. The ponytail battle maiden then called the teaching assistant over. The assistant stepped forward and pulled the cloth off the device it had been covering. A large blue crystal orb was revealed underneath. One of the students couldn't contain themselves and exclaimed that it was a magical energy measuring device, and that these were extremely hard to come by. The ponytail battle maiden explained that as a mage, the very first thing was to understand your own magical energy readings. Only then could you train and improve in ways suited to your situation. She also said the measuring device was simple to use. Just place your hand on the crystal orb and channel magical energy into it. The cute girl did as instructed. The crystal orb immediately let out a series of soft tones. The measurement began and results appeared. The purification value displayed on the screen was 4. The ponytail battle maiden explained for the class that the most important figure among the indicators was the central reading, called the purification value, which displayed magical energy quality on a scale of 1 to 10. The cute girl's quality was level 4. Last year's incoming students had averaged level 3, and she praised her for being quite excellent. The cute girl beamed with delight and thanked the professor. The ponytail battle maiden continued explaining. Magical energy volume was divided into 100 levels, and measuring it was just as simple. Channel as much as you could until you reached your limit. After the test concluded, the ponytail battle maiden announced that the cute girl's magical energy volume came in at level 17. Last year's class had averaged level 15, which also put her toward the higher end. She then said that from both quality and volume together, it was clear how hard the cute girl worked every day, and she was very pleased to have a class representative like her. I smiled quietly to myself. So this was how the ponytail battle maiden handled her noble female students. And looking at the freckled boy's expression of pure longing beside me, he was clearly the kind of student who was naturally well behaved and needed no such handling. The ponytail battle maiden then said she had something to attend to and stepped out, leaving everyone to carry out the measurements under the teaching assistant's guidance. The freckled boy tugged my sleeve and said we should go get ours done too. I glanced over at the white-haired boy who was fast asleep with his face on the desk. Before I could even call out to him, the teaching assistant's voice carried over, announcing that the highest result so far was purification level 6, with a magical energy volume also the highest so far at level 20. The student introduced herself after. I noted to myself that she was from the same family family as my old rival, but her hair color was different. She was clearly from a branch line. The assistant then praised her for being a credit to her distinguished family and encouraged her to focus on training and building up her magical energy volume. At that moment, the white-haired boy was stirred awake by the noise around him and let out a long yawn. He mumbled that it was so loud and asked what everyone was doing. I told him they were getting their magical energy measured. The white-haired boy's eyes immediately lit up, and he said excitedly that he wanted to try too. I pressed a hand to my forehead in resignation and thought to myself, don't suddenly get this worked up. Why am I the only one who finds this embarrassing? The students nearby began whispering among themselves. By now, they all knew the white-haired boy was the legendary young heir of the Brando family, and that I was a commoner, but one with genuinely impressive ability. The teaching assistant looked up when they saw the white-haired boy and addressed him with a slightly more respectful tone, inviting him to go ahead and take the measurement. The white-haired boy pointed the crystal orb and asked if he just had to channel magical energy into it. I nodded to confirm. He placed his hand on it, and the moment he started channeling, the measuring device spun into motion at a furious pace. Everyone in the room went wide-eyed. Even the branch line young lady who had just scored the highest readings was visibly stunned. The teaching assistant stared at the numbers on the screen, voice trembling. Purification level 9, magical energy volume level 67, and said in amazement these readings were truly monster-tier talent. I felt completely calm on the inside. After all, when ordinary people encounter a genuine genius, this was more or less the reaction you could expect. That was the kind of gap in talent that ordinary people simply had no framework to comprehend, as insurmountable as a towering wall. Though I had known the white-haired boy was a genius, I hadn't expected his numbers to be this high. This was how monsters from the Brando family were made. The white-haired boy was simply different from everyone else from birth. If only the version of him from my past life had put in even a fraction of real effort, the map of the continent might have looked entirely different, which was exactly why in this life, I intended to change the future, to make the Brando family a permanent thorn in the side of the Declan family, and to let the white-haired boy grow into something truly extraordinary. The teaching assistant wiped a bead of sweat from their forehead and reminded the white-haired boy not to let it go to his head. A mage's level wasn't determined by magical energy readings alone. The white-haired boy turned to confirm that I hadn't gone yet, then immediately pushed me to go get measured. I thought to myself, everyone was probably curious about my level. A commoner, standing at the side of the Brando family's young heir, and who had beaten a noble fist-fighting young lord on top of that. Fine then, let's get it done. To avoid drawing trouble, I just needed to land somewhere in the middle range. I quietly adjusted the properties of my magical energy and prepared to channel a controlled amount. But the moment I touched the crystal orb, I could tell something was wrong. Wait, why was the baseline of this measuring device set so low? At this rate, the reading would come out far higher than I had planned. The screen immediately flashed with a purification level of 10. Then the measuring device let out a sharp alarm, displaying, value exceeds baseline setting, please reset the baseline. The classroom erupted at once. The white-haired boy shot his hand up and cheered that I was incredible. I quickly told the teaching assistant that the crystal orb had malfunctioned and needed to be remeasured. The white-haired boy immediately argued loudly that it had not malfunctioned at all. I shot him a sharp look and told him to be quiet. The teaching assistant hurried to adjust the device and said the baseline had been reset. I could try again. The second reading came back. Purification level 3, total magical energy volume level 15. I quietly breathed out in relief, thinking that being more careful with my control this time had finally brought the numbers down to where I wanted them. Then the white-haired boy suddenly blurted out, "What was I playing at?" I blinked and asked him where he had picked up that phrase. He looked perfectly innocent and said, "Well, I had used it before, so it must mean something like going off the rails." I told him firmly that the going off the rails phrase was mine alone to use. The white-haired boy immediately argued back without missing a beat, asking why he couldn't use it too. Evening, the first magic hall. Inside the ponytail battle maiden's office, she was turning it over in her mind. Why would the Declan family's fire demon suddenly attack the berserker professor? Then again, forget it, the berserker professor should be able to handle it on his own. It had nothing to do with her anyway. At that point, the teaching assistant knocked and stepped in, respectfully informing the ponytail battle maiden that the magical energy readings from today had been compiled and brought over. She reached out and took them. She noted that the branch line young lady, being a member of the Dainai family, had put up numbers that were less impressive than expected. The white-haired boy was without question the most talented child the Brando family had produced in its entire history. It seemed worthwhile to guide him carefully. As she flipped through, the ponytail battle maiden suddenly stopped turning pages, her eyes locking onto one particular entry. That entry noted that a data error had occurred on the first measurement, so it had been retaken. She focused on the error code. The value had exceeded the configured baseline. She thought it over for a moment and said she would need to keep a particular eye on me as well. At the same time, over in the student common room, the white-haired boy was excitedly showing us the results of his magical energy manipulation. I suggested he make it more vivid, have it look like it was about to fly forward, with wings spread and mouth open. I also reminded him that he remembered the bronze lion at home, right? How impressive it looked with its mouth open wide like that. The freckled boy stood watching this unfold, and his feelings were complicated. I could guess what was going through his head. Even a branch line young lady, as capable as she was, could only produce a regular dodecahedron, while the white-haired boy was treating the magical energy manipulation exercise like a game he was playing for fun. There was always someone higher, always someone better. The freckled boy was probably feeling pretty useless right about now. I understood how he felt, but what was done was done. The only thing left was to accept reality and keep moving. The white-haired boy, oblivious to everyone else's mood, called out to me cheerfully. He said today had been so much fun. He really had made the right choice coming to the academy. I liked that about the white-haired boy, his innocence and honesty, and I was determined not to let him turn into the kind of monster he had been in my past life. I smiled back at him and said we'd keep having fun and going to school together from here on out. Time slipped by, and a month had passed before I knew it. Taking advantage of a moment when my roommate was away, I pulled out the dimensional storage bag I had taken from the fire demon. The bag was locked, but as long as you understood the underlying principles of the security magic and had a bit of magical intuition, cracking the user set magical pattern wasn't difficult. With proper equipment, it could be done in under a week, but working in secret inside my personal training room was all I could manage, and it had taken me a full month. Over that same month, the spirit medicine the Brando family had given me had been fully absorbed and converted into magical energy. And in this academy, I had also picked up quite a bit of knowledge that would prove useful to me. All in all, I had finally managed to open the dimensional storage bag. I went through the contents one by one: a few vials of potion, a cloak I couldn't wear, and a protective artifact. That last one had some use. As I kept searching, my eyes lit up. There it was. A Declan family grimoire of secret texts, and not just any. It was the lower-level blue fire text that the Declan clan head himself had used, the kind of infuriating magic that could burn through even a force field. Of course, reaching the point where you could actually burn through a force field required mastering it to a high level of refinement, not something learned overnight. I'd need to study and work through it slowly. After finishing the search and tidying everything up, I suddenly remembered today was the midterm exam. I hurried to change and headed to the assembly square. The white-haired boy was exclaiming excitedly about how many people there were. The freckled boy beside him explained that every magic track student from M1 through our own M3 class was gathered here. He then dropped his voice and added that the exam format this time was very likely the canyon breakthrough. He said a classmate had overheard a professor complaining recently about having to go fix up the canyon at the busiest possible time, which had to mean preparations for the exam. If the midterm was a practical exam, it could take one of three formats. The first was the gauntlet tube, navigating a maze-like underground waterway to reach the destination point. The second was the canyon breakthrough, ranked by the order in which students reached the destination. The third was the simulation exam, actual combat against people or simulated monsters. For me personally, the format didn't matter. All I needed was to pass. But the freckled boy clearly saw things differently. He looked like he had his heart set on the canyon breakthrough. Just then, the berserker professor called for everyone's attention, then walked forward and greeted the assembled crowd. He introduced himself as the professor in charge of this midterm exam. Looking at those panda-like dark circles under his eyes, I couldn't hold back a small smile, and reflected that people in academic research really were lunatics who had no regard for their own health. The berserker professor then announced that the exam format would be the gauntlet tube. The freckled boy heard this and immediately fell to pieces. He went pale and murmured to himself that his entire plan had fallen apart, and couldn't hold back a muttered curse of liar. The berserker professor paid no attention to the restless murmuring below and went on to explain the rules. He said the format was simple: pass through the maze-shaped underground waterway and reach the final stage to complete the exam. He also explained that any branch in the waterway would eventually lead to the destination, but that would just turn the exam into a meaningless race to the finish. As he said it, he activated one of his skills and summoned a golem, saying the golem would add a little something interesting to the exam. The room immediately buzzed with noise as students broke into discussion. The berserker professor raised a hand to signal for quiet and explained that the golem was essentially a sluggish combat machine. Everyone should be able to handle it without too much trouble. Given that it might still be a stretch for everyone's current level, he had left its core exposed on the outside and deliberately reduced its durability as well. After he finished, the students remained noisy, still grumbling with complaints. The berserker professor thought to himself, the scarred young man he'd seen before had shown a fierce drive to push himself to his limit. Was it the environment that shaped a person's state of mind? That said, he could see that a few of the students here were genuinely promising. Some of them had a look of firm resolve, some had sharp, focused eyes, and one or two carried a kind of quiet steadiness about them. But when his gaze landed on the white-haired boy, he couldn't help but think with quiet resignation. This particular student seemed to have nothing on his mind at all. The berserker professor called for quiet again and said the golem would only serve as a gatekeeper at the junctions inside the waterway. Students could choose to fight through it or take a detour, entirely up to each person. He then said he would be distributing exam-issue wristbands to everyone. Once the force field of a wristband was broken, that student would be automatically eliminated, and the golem would ignore anyone who had already been eliminated. Finally, the berserker professor told everyone to try their best to leave a strong impression on him, whether by reaching the destination the fastest or by eliminating the most opponents along the way. If they could make him remember them, he would set aside a special reward just for that person, and said it was one that would not disappoint. Something stirred in me at that. A reward that wouldn't disappoint was exactly what I was looking for. My thoughts went immediately to the largest library on the eastern continent. The library was divided into 3 tiers: upper, middle, and lower, and right now I was only allowed access to the lower level. Finding any leads on the grimoire would require reaching the middle level or above, but those were restricted to royalty, high nobles, and members of distinguished families. The only other path in was with recommendations from 3 or more professors, which meant I had to earn the berserker professor's special reward if I wanted to keep investigating this matter. I had originally planned to coast along as a middling student and take it easy, but reality clearly wasn't going to allow that. So here I was. The berserker professor's voice came again, telling everyone to go collect what they needed from the teaching assistants. assistance. The place livened up immediately. Some students asked assistance for blast flowers and firestones. Someone tried to request a golem controller and was flatly refused by the assistant. I watched the chaos unfolding in front of me and thought to myself, what a mess. I couldn't even tell whether these were mages or alley scoundrels. When I turned my head, I saw the white-haired boy loudly asking someone for 20 vine seeds. The person laughed and said they weren't an assistant, but they did happen to have the seeds he was looking for. The white-haired boy asked very earnestly if they could spare some, explaining that even though he had no plant-type affinity, he knew plant-type magic. He might look like a cheerful airhead most of the time, but he had a sharp head on his shoulders when it counted. I thought to myself, even the white-haired boy, who normally only cared about having fun, was preparing seriously for this exam. I wondered whether the pressure of the exam might be enough to awaken some hidden potential in the freckled boy too. The buzz of the amplification magic crackled to life. Each student's starting point had been randomly assigned. The berserker professor told everyone to find their name and take their position at the corresponding starting point. I checked the list and saw I was at starting point 3. The white-haired boy waved at me from across the crowd and said he'd see me inside. The freckled boy said his goodbyes too and wished me and the white-haired boy good luck on the exam. Arriving at starting point 3 reminded me of my days as a crisis management specialist, when I'd be sent out alone to carry out a mission alongside other unfamiliar units, always an inexplicably awkward feeling. Just then, a young man with an arrogant, surly look on his face came and stopped in front of me. He'd heard I was pretty capable and said he had a proposal for me. I replied flatly that he should go ahead and say it. He got straight to the point. He was buying eliminated wristbands, 30 gold coins apiece. Aside from me and his group, there were 3 other people at starting point 3, and if I could deal with them, he'd pay 90 gold coins. My mind ran the numbers quickly. 30 gold coins was a full month's income for an ordinary commoner family. I hadn't expected an eliminated wristband to be worth that much. Seeing that I hadn't responded, he added that for someone from the gray zone like me, this offer should be more than fair. Someone else might have been put off by what they were doing and called it underhanded, but when you got down to it, they were simply good at using the resources they had to solve problems. In a way, settling things directly with money was actually a pretty clever approach. Seeing that I still hadn't spoken, he sweetened the offer, 35 gold coins per wristband, 105 in total. I shook my head slowly and said, well now, young masters, you've got your numbers wrong. Including all of them, the total was 6 people.